Hey, everybody. So I figured it'd be as good a time as any to jump in and start having a conversation about this. Obviously, we did a live show last night and we had thoughts. And when we went over it and talked about our personal rankings, what we came out with was essentially the same thing as what the committee just came out with. Some of you probably checked that live show out. Some of you didn't. It was at the same time as the Florida State game because they tend to back things up back to back. But I thought it was as good a time as any to get in here and start discussing it. If you're interested in jumping into conversation, it's going to be a lot easier if I have one or two other people available. So feel free to hit the request to speak button and jump in. I know a number of you have been following us for uh, let conference commandos in. Hey man, how you doing?
What's up, bro? What's going on, man?
Not too much. So we've interacted on Twitter enough. I don't think we've ever actually been live on audio together.
Nah,
Yeah,
definitely not, man. Need to get you up to Clemson and get to hang out with y'all. Hadn't
yeah,
hadn't got to
sure.
talk or see y'all or anything, but yeah, for sure. Appreciate you having me on.
Yeah, and it's funny because the two of us have a lot of similar thoughts in a lot of areas. I don't
Yep.
know if we're 100% aligned on this one, and your perspective on this is ACC based, but we have in the past had a lot of similarities to the playoff and the expanded playoff. And I know the two of us were discussing earlier, there are a lot of things in this current situation that point to the reality of um, the limitations of the 14 playoff. And what I think a lot of people know is we've been a proponent of a 16 playoff for a long time. And we've been opposed to the 12-team playoff. And our argument was always that four teams actually was pretty restrictive, and that if you ever were in a situation where you had five conference champions that were all deserving, you were going to have no way to try to normalize that or rectify it in any way. And that's the problem we ended up with. And so our argument had always been that if you had six teams, you do not do automatic qualifiers. If you're a good Power Five champion, you're always going to end up in the top six. That's happened every single year, every time, without any question. Then you're going to capture a scenario like what happened this year. And it also guaranteed in the current Power Five plus G5 structure the ability for a G5 team to get in. But we didn't do that. So we were currently at four, and we had the nightmare scenario where you had all five Power Five conferences produce a team that had a very good argument at being in the playoff, and you're forced to leave out one. Could have been worse. We could have had an undefeated G5 that had beaten a P5, and that didn't happen. So I think at the onset, as people sort of jump in here, maybe the first thing to talk about a little bit is the reality of the playoffs. I think 12 is still too many because now you end up in a situation where presently Georgia would be number five. If you look at the current structure with what they're going with next year, Liberty ends up being the automatic qualifier seed for the last conference champion, which is kind of silly in my opinion. And so Georgia starts the year or the playoff slate by playing the 12th seed Liberty, who has to jump 11 and 12, which I think right now would be Ole Miss and Penn State, or Ole Miss Oklahoma. It's actually Oklahoma that gets left out in favor of Liberty. I almost feel like that's an advantage for Georgia in that scenario because they get to go play a tune-up game, kind of keep themselves fresh, while the top four teams actually sit on the bench. Um, Conference Commandos, I know that's something we've talked about a lot, so I'm kind of curious your thoughts on that specific issue.
Yeah, I think a lot of the points are kind of some of the things I've said. I see Andrew Percival just joined. His thing has kind of been bracket luck for sure, which is kind of what you've been talking about. A lot of these teams that don't make the conference title game, I mean, they get an inherent advantage with the extra week of prep, and then with bracket luck, like the example I've used was last year Ohio State lost to Michigan in 2022. If you look at the projected playoff field with the 12 teams, Ohio State would have actually had a more favorable draw. And again, Andrew Percival tweeted this. I forgot what the exact odds were, but Ohio State's national title odds went up in the playoff just because of their slate. I forgot who Michigan would have had to play against, but I think it was like Alabama and USC. The winner of that was who Michigan would have had to have played, which is and Ohio State didn't have it as bad. I can't remember. So bracket luck is an angle for me. Um, yeah, I have a real issue with a G5 auto bid as well. I know y'all do. I had another point I was going to say, I forgot, but
Yeah,
that's kind of what
that's
I think.
yeah, it's good, and we're getting more people in. So again, if there are a couple of people that requested, if you want to join the conversation, feel free to hit the mic, and I'll try to hit people up as they will. And I'll probably there's some people we interact with a lot, and I may bring some of you on like conference commandos, and then there's some others that have requested, and I'll have you on for like you know, we'll go on 60 seconds, ask a question, we interact a little bit, and then I may pop you off just to let people rotate through. And I'll note it's just Josh today. The reality is we may think we're important. but then we have children and they control our lives. So Daniel, I believe, is 6-year-old's Chuck E. Cheese birthday party, and that is the reality of
Yes.
the holiday season for everybody for sure. But we wanted to have a reaction, so I figured I'd go on and start this. Bill Bixby wanted to hop on. I'm going to put you on for a minute and let you ask your question. We'll talk for a second. Hey, Bill, as soon as you connect, you should be live. I think you have to unmute by default.
Hello? Hey, I'm sorry. Hey, guys.
Hey, man.
Hey, how's it going? How's it going? I always love you guys' content, man. Always do great work. Thanks for having me on. All right, two quick things that I take it off the air. First, do people realize that if Georgia won yesterday, that it would have been between Texas and FSU, and Texas would have gotten in? And that go ahead.
That's a fair point.
Yeah, and also
Yeah.
my other point is, like, I agree with you guys. The automatic qualifiers stink, right? If you're good enough in your conference, you're gonna be top 12 anyway. But all these people crying about FSU, are they going to talk to the ACC commissioner, who's one of the commissioners who blocked the 12-teamer for this year? And I'll take it off the air, guys.
I appreciate it. And yeah, I mean, feel free to, ask a question or stick around when we're talking to the end. But the first point is actually pretty good, right? That there's all this conversation about Alabama versus FSU, but this is always going to be the nature of a playoff and however many teams are there. You're always going to argue over the last one in and the first one out, which right now is Alabama and FSU. But if it wasn't for the fact that this scenario that Alabama actually beat Georgia, Georgia's absolutely in, Washington's absolutely in, Michigan's absolutely in, and then you would have had Florida State versus Texas, and Texas would have been in, I'm pretty sure. And frankly, all the arguments that we're having about Florida State and Alabama almost equally apply to Texas. In fact, in a lot of ways, and I had said this last night on the live show, people were asking about who's going to be in, and the conversation at one point trended towards Texas versus Alabama. And I made pretty clear early on, I thought the argument was much stronger for Alabama over FSU. But by the same token, that's because I think the argument was really close between Texas and Alabama. And I do think the Texas head-to-head win has to matter. And look, this is something I've said a number of times, and we talked about it on the live show, and they posited this, or Daniel posited this to me, to sort of talk about just balance evenly quality and strength of record and who would you put in between Texas and Alabama. And in isolation, I said probably by a hair Alabama, but the caveat there was the question I got asked. The moment you start doing a real ranking, this whole thing about just quality, just strength of record, it isn't really true. It's never anything they've gone by. If you look at it historically, they've always included more teams in the top strength of record than they have top quality. It's just quality has to trump everything else in certain situations. But the two other big things that matter, one of which is, are you a conference champion? They have always given a tremendous amount of weight to conference champions the entirety of the history of the playoff. And no one that had the same record as a conference champion really has ever been left out with anything remotely resembling the same resume if you were a non-champion. Obviously, non-champions have gotten in, but they've gotten lucky in the year of which that happened, that they didn't end up having to go head-to-head. And the other thing is head-to-heads carried a significant amount of weight. Those two things are the things that put Texas ahead. So at the end of our live show last night, I made clear, because I realized how people probably took that if I were doing the ranking myself, I would put Texas ahead of Alabama. But, again, it is interesting because I think the Alabama-Texas conversation was pretty close, and it is just a head-to-head issue. But resume and everything else lined up. If you pretend that Texas didn't beat Alabama, but Texas beat somebody of equal strength to Alabama, let's say Texas beat Ohio State and Alabama lost to Ohio State, I'm not sure that Alabama isn't over Texas. It's specifically the fact that they played each other. And so, to that regard, Florida State's issue is the same issue with Alabama as it is with Texas. And I'll repeat the thing I said last night, which I think is totally true. One, Daniel's position had more or less been that even with Jordan Travis, he might have slightly leaned towards putting FSU out. And I'm not sure if I'm 100% there, but I would have a very, very hard conversation. And I think I would still probably argue for FSU out given the exact same results over the course of the year. But without Jordan Travis, it just completely changes the conversation because I don't think there are many people that realistically think Florida State, in the current state of the program, what they were the last 2 weeks, had any realistic shot of beating Michigan. And including a team that you don't think has any real chance to win, it's just not reasonable. And they beat Florida at the end of the year, but they beat Florida, who actually had their backup quarterback for the majority of that game themselves, in an ugly game. They had a really up against Louisville. and there's just not a lot of indication they can score. Louisville is also an odd team because not only did they lose to Kentucky, but there's a complication there too with Louisville and how they've lost and where they've struggled over the course of the year. Louisville has major issues at the offensive line position, and when they've played teams that have better defensive fronts, they've struggled mightily at times.
Yeah, for sure. And a point
It,
I've kind of made, I'll let you, I just wanted to say this. I think Louisville is a super weird team, both just from a resume perspective, because they have two very conflicting out of conference points. The Notre Dame win was awesome. The O line was mashing in that game. They looked really good from a scheme and just uh, the way the line plays with like leverage and technique looked really good. And then Kentucky was a real bad point. Plummer and that offensive line are so hot or cold. Like they just have games where they're on, like because Plummer's efficiency numbers are really good, but then he just has games where he just doesn't show up. It's really weird. They're a weird team. And then as you said with the fronts, the last 4 games they played Virginia, who didn't have a great front, but then North Carolina, Miami was a bit more of a challenge, and they really weren't that great. They're a weird team for sure.
yeah, the NC State game is another one, right, with a team that's kind of a different profile, I
Yeah,
think, than some other teams, and they were. I mean, they were pretty miserable in that game. And the other problem with Plummer is, like you said, he is hot or cold. Threw 2 interceptions in that game. It was, what is it, 12 or 13 as of the end of the season. So it, when you look at FSU's resume and beating Louisville, and it's easy to talk about them shutting down Louisville's offense, which I think does matter. But I think it's also important to keep in mind that Louisville had a number of games where their offense really struggled, actually. Like even the Pitt game, they only scored 21 points. NC State, they only scored 13. Um, so it's hard to evaluate them overall. The other interesting one that we never really talked about too much, we'll probably talk about it in the preview for sure, is I think people make a little too much actually of the Oklahoma State loss to Texas, interestingly. And again, because the focus was on Alabama and FSU, there really hasn't been a lot of nitpicking of Texas's resume standpoint argument for being number three. In our metrics, Oklahoma State's pass defense is 117th. I mean, their run defense is around 50th, but the pass defense is just horrid, has been all year. And when you talk bad losses, like a lot of people have been talking about that Auburn game for Alabama that took a miracle to win. Absolutely true. Now, Auburn is 30th in FPI. They had a really terrible loss to New Mexico State where they were blown out, manhandled. But that game was also really uncharacteristic for Auburn. They're not a great team. By elite standards, we would generally say they're a bad team, but bad means outside the top 30 by a hair. Um, but by the same token, when you start making those arguments, Oklahoma State has a lot of the same problems. I mean, the Oklahoma State at the beginning of the year lost 33-7 to South Alabama. That's awful. South Alabama's a worse team than New Mexico State, who's just went 10-4. I think they were 11-win team last year, and they were blown out 45-3 to a really bad UCF team, and that was just 3 weeks ago. So when you talk about Oklahoma State and the Texas Oklahoma State team, this is an Oklahoma State team that gave up 34 to BYU last week, 30 to Houston the week prior, 45 to UCF the week prior than that. They have been atrocious defensively for the last 4 weeks.
yeah. Oklahoma State can't generate sacks. They have a lot of plays where it's just like they'll try to blitz or they'll stun or whatever, and they leave those guys on DBs on islands, or they'll play like a zone where they'll play like the 5 or 6 man zone where it's just big areas and they can't cover. It's a big liability for sure. They struggle on defense.
Yeah, and they had their veteran. They had really had one good corner, and he got hurt early in the Texas game. So they were at one point, I think, playing three true freshmen in the secondary. Both primary corners, I believe, were true freshmen
And they've
in
been
the game.
ravaged by the portal at DB for the past couple of years.
Yeah, so I'm just saying when you break down all this stuff and where all these teams are at, and it was a really good point that I think Bill Bixby raised, which is the conversation's been entirely about Alabama and FSU, and it's because Texas did dominate that game to Oklahoma State. But I do want to flag Oklahoma State is unusually bad defensively versus the past. It has been a problem with them all year. It's not light to say that it's a problem with them because again, UCF is a bad team, and UCF beat them 45-3. So when you talk about all these different things, frankly, I think there's been a massive overreaction to that Oklahoma team. A team 65th in our metrics in rush defense, 118th in pass defense, and honestly, offensively, they're 97th in passing, 42nd in rushing. I'm trying to pull up our power rating right now on the fly. I'm sure you can hear the clicky clack of my cherry keys, but Oklahoma State is 60th in our power ranking. I mean, they're behind like Auburn, they're behind Northwestern, they're behind Illinois, behind Georgia Tech. And I do think there's probably from everyone there's a little bit of an overreaction to that blowout of Texas from Texas of Oklahoma State because they may have been a ranked, but frankly, I think they were ranked by a little bit of mirage. There's a lot of scheduling luck. They were one of one or two teams that caught all four of the new conference teams. They played Cincinnati, UCF, Houston, and BYU. and that, I mean, it's just a big boon to them. And then again, out of conference, they played Arizona State as their P5. Arizona State's one of the worst P5s in the country, and they lost their G5 game to South Alabama. So they end the year at 9-3, but the end of the year at 9-3 with, if you look at it from a 2022 perspective, only having played 6 P5s. Of those 6 P5s, the two best by far were Kansas and Oklahoma. Um, both of those were one-score games. They beat Oklahoma by 3. And frankly, I think that entire season for Oklahoma State came down to the fact, I won't call it a fluke per se, because it's not like the game itself was that fluky, but it's a fluke result. And similar to Florida beating Tennessee, was really fluky. We did a tweet a while back where we talked about tiers in the SEC. And if you break it down, there's actually 3 clear tiers. And I wonder if I can find this while I'm talking. At the top, you had Alabama, Georgia. Um, and then as you went through, um, there were just sort of striations, and Tennessee's in the middle striation there with Missouri and I believe Ole Miss, and everybody in the first tier beat everybody below them. Everybody in the second tier beat everybody below them, with the one exception being the Tennessee loss to Florida. And I think Oklahoma State is a little bit similar. That State win over Oklahoma is pretty inexplicable. And because of Oklahoma State's schedule not playing Texas in the regular season, which I think they would have gotten demolished, and the fact that they caught all 4 of the new entrants, which almost no one else did in the Big 12. And again, the new entrants with 4-22 versus the old teams kind of put Oklahoma State in the conference championship game. And again, we rank often far too much based off record and not quality. And that put Oklahoma State as a ranked team. And again, they're not even a top 60 team in our power rating. I even think the ranking itself is baffling just because the South Alabama loss is so bad. But it is the weight of that Oklahoma win and a little bit of the momentum of trying to rank so many teams within the same conference. So I'm going to let Andrew Percival in because he's another guy that we've interacted with a lot and his rankings have been good. And then I'm going to hop to Preston. You'll be the next one up because I know you've been requesting to jump in a minute.
What's up, Andrew?
Hey, Andrew, you're live, probably muted by default.
Back from Vegas.
Yeah, I'm back, and I just want to say I'll be honest. Like, I'm a Washington fan, but I'm a little upset right now. With the decision to include Alabama over Florida State, and it's rooted in my love of this format. Like, I absolutely love this format for the insane amount of intensity that it injects into the regular season, and I've always had a really good feeling and level of confidence over how they operate, and that there are certain unwritten rules to how teams are ranked and what you have to do, and that there's a little bit of uncertainty in that, but that the sport is better off if fans just embrace that uncertainty and enjoy these, fantastic high stakes games from September to November. And that it's really not a technical analysis. I don't get a little uncomfortable, whether it's like on a statistical bent or whether it's a personnel guy of some sort trying to evaluate on-field personnel. I remember as a Washington fan in 2016 going through it for the first time and seeing like Kirk Herbstreit talk about Penn State's linebackers, and I just remember being like, okay, timeout, like, come on. So for the first time in 10 years right now, I'm a little like the worldview has been shattered a little bit, in that what I've always thought they did is separate teams into buckets of deservingness, and then once you're in a bucket, then they can go kind of power rank and kind of let it go from there. And I always thought, and we've tweeted about it a ton, that the most significant bucket of deservingness to get in was to be a Power 5 conference champ with 0-1 loss. And like that, those are first in line. And I guess, like, I really did think that there was some significance between that 0 and that 1, even fully acknowledging that Alabama is better than Florida State. And to me, where I really think was a seminal year and kind of understanding how it largely worked for a long time was 2015, when you had a Big Ten championship game of Iowa and Michigan State. I think Iowa was in the mid-20s in S&P Plus at the time. Michigan State was in the mid-teens. I mean, that was a pillow fight of a Big Ten title game. And
incredible game.
It was amazing, but it was a given that both teams, no matter who won, both teams were going to be underdogs, significant underdogs in their next game. And they both got blasted in that game. So to me, it was kind of like, okay, the rules of this thing are set. they say four best, but really what that means is sorting best within tiers of deservingness. And I think when you look at Florida State, you do see ambition intended with their schedule. Playing LSU and I honestly and again, like I'm someone that really part of why I love the 14 format so much was I really was a true believer in the sense that like that there's not an SEC bias. If you do the juxtapose CFP rankings with advanced metrics, you're going to come to the opposite conclusion. The SEC is not overrated. In fact, if anything, it's underrated. Like I'm that guy. I'm not like one of these, hate the SEC today is reveals that the fix was in and none of that. But I do think that for proof of concept, that the format was as virtuous as some of us claimed that it was. We did need that proof of concept that they had it in them with the right confluence of events to exclude the SEC. And I thought this was going to be the year, and that we could point to an incredible regular season matchup that did that. And so I am surprised, and maybe some of it's selfishness because as a Washington fan, I wanted the field to be as weak as it possibly could, which I know that kind of proves the point that they did the right thing. But yeah, no. Long and short, I'm a little overwhelmed today. I did not expect this. This really surprised me. So that's all I got. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think that the point you made there towards the end, I think, was important, and it's this thing we started on before most of you joined. We talked last night about our personal rankings, and this was the way I came out and saying this is the way I think I would have ranked it with Texas 3 and Alabama 4. And I thought the call between FSU, Alabama, and Texas was really tough. And to me, it really just came down to the reality that I don't think this Florida State team can meaningfully compete with, say, Michigan without Jordan Travis. The last couple weeks, they have not been the same team. The offense has really fallen off. We were talking earlier about Louisville, kind of within that context, that you can talk about them beating a top 15 Louisville, but I think Louisville's ranking is really sketchy to start with there. And then the Florida game, that's a bad Florida team. It's 5-7 with their backup quarterback for the majority of that game, and they still really struggled. So I think this is just a situation where the quality perspective was overwhelming. And I'll make one more point here before EP. I see you've requested, and I think you're the next one in line. Before I get to it, there's another interesting point to me too with the LSU game, and I'm going to say this and probably make a couple people mad, but I'm going to say it and just throw it out there. I think we all have a little bit of a bad memory of how that game actually went and was going. Halfway through the third quarter, okay, that game was tied LSU 17, FSU 17. Your win probability thing on ESPN, which to be frank, I think is a little bit junk. Alabama's had a 99.9% chance to lose in the Iron Bowl 2 times in the last 3 years, which sounds really fun until you realize at some level when you're saying there's a 1 in 10,000 chance of winning those two games, maybe you're way overreactionary. I don't think their win probability system quite works. And I think it's probably based off situational football, and there's probably a lot of things it doesn't take into account of if it's 4th and 31 and you're playing a team that's a lot more talented than you, then the chances are very different than a team that's less. But point being, LSU had about a 2/3 chance of winning that game midway through the third quarter. What happened is that Florida State got a couple stops, got a couple scores, built a 2-score lead. All of a sudden, they were up. It was a 1-score game to start the fourth quarter. They did not get their second touchdown, a 2-score lead, until 10 minutes left in the fourth. And, they tacked on 21 points in that fourth quarter to make it 45-24. LSU just kind of quit. And I think we kind of forget that game was that competitive, that Alabama, was a game that was a lot closer, but a game that LSU was sort of fighting in more. And about the time that Daniels went down in the Alabama game was the same time that Florida State actually pulled away. And yeah, I do think that is to a significant degree just kind of really forgotten in that game and the way it went and sort of the game flow of it. Not to I'm not trying to discount it in any way, but just
Yeah,
trying to establish the fact that I think Alabama and Florida State both had a very similar win over LSU, but I do think that Florida State blowout over LSU, it was not quite the dominant performance that we all remember. They outgained LSU by about 35 yards. LSU had more first downs than Florida State did. It's just LSU turned the ball over more than Florida State and kind of got run out in the fourth quarter in catch-up mode.
Yeah, for sure. I think I think most fans, including likely everybody in the football offices in Ann Arbor, Michigan, I don't think anybody would dispute that Alabama much better equipped to compete with Michigan. It's more just the breach from precedent. And I think in some ways, like if you just say it's as simple as, yeah, if Travis hadn't been hurt, even if all the metrics and all the analytics and all the attempts to predict the best sourced attempts to predict all pointed to FSU's favor. If Travis wasn't hurt, we still would have put them in. And in some ways, that's more comforting because I get it. But I think it's the upsetting thing for this is it's really the breach from precedent that I think is the thing that's got a lot of people upset.
Yeah, and the last thing I'll say before I flip on EP, because I do want to give some other people a chance to ask questions and stuff. That's a fun thing with these Twitter Spaces. My perspective on this is if FSU had ended the year way they did with, they probably, I think by a hair they get left out anyway. But the trick is, Travis, with the team we had in the first half of the year, ideally they don't struggle the way they did the last 2 weeks. And the fact that they did, and the fact that I have that opinion goes back to, just like you were saying, Andrew, earlier, the part of you as a Washington fan is to say, I'm really disappointed in this because I wanted the easier slate, which in and of itself speaks to why why this wasn't necessarily the right way to go. And again, you watch the Michigan reaction, which is floating around Twitter to Alabama being announced, and it's the immediate reactions have grown before somebody smart makes them all start clapping. Everybody kind of knew this was the team that was most likely to win the playoff, and I think that ends up trumping all the other concerns. All right, EP, I'm gonna get you in here because I know you've been waiting a while. Let you ask a question. So you're now connecting. Should be on as soon as you hit on mute.
Things. So basically, I'm a Michigan fan, and if I was a Florida State fan right now, I'd feel pretty, shitty just because, they beat an LSU team who was, top 15, and then even without their quarterback, they beat another top, 16 team, and I feel like the committee didn't really stay consistent with how they've been throughout the year, and also just throughout history of the college football playoff. So basically, as a Michigan fan, we didn't play any Power Five outside of conference. Michigan struggled with teams. Alabama struggled with teams. Florida State did. So I think it's a little unfair, two teams to jump them when they just beat a top 16 team, by double digits. I know a lot of people have feelings that Louisville's not that good, and maybe they aren't, but the committee still has them at 16. And not to say that, I think Bama isn't better than Florida State. I'd probably pick them, but I would have picked Bama as a 2-loss team probably over Florida State if they lost the Auburn game and beat Georgia. So I think everyone's always kind of had the understanding that you pick the most deserving alongside you compare resumes. So, all undefeated teams you compare, all one-loss teams you compare in the Power Five. So, I mean, I wouldn't have had an issue if they would have been consistent with this throughout, the history or even the year. But for, a 7 and an 8 ranked team or whatever they were ranked to just jump them after they beat a top 15 team, it just doesn't seem very fair to me. But go Blue.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's all fair, but again, the problem you run into is when we talk consistency, I'm not sure we've ever really had this specific situation where you had the undefeated P5 who was almost universally considered to be a major underdog or worse than the team that you were leaving out. And when you look at, like, I'm flipping through prior years now, and it just doesn't come up. Like we haven't really been in this position to where you've had to make this consideration, right? Like 2019, you have one loss Oklahoma, but the 3 undefeateds were LSU, Ohio State, and Clemson. And so, it just hasn't been an issue the committee's ever had to deal with or hasn't had to deal with, at least in recent years. And maybe the closest was the Alabama, Wisconsin, Ohio State comparison back in 2017, but that was kind of taken care of by Ohio State having 2 losses. So, I hear you, but I also think it's easy to say it's not consistent, but I think it's a little more complicated when you parse out the fact that really they've never had it with this specific issue. Let's see if I can.
The tough part is the best 4, quote unquote, is just so ambiguous and like ill-defined. Like it's just, I think one of my friends, Ben Weinberg, who's a big Northwestern guy, he made this point. I think we're just really lucky to have avoided a situation like this for a decade. Like it's just tough.
Yeah, I'm with you. It just like you said, there's a reason we always lobbied on our channel for a 16 playoff. Um, 12 is going to be too many. 5v12 is not going to be fun. 5v12 or 12 is Liberty is really not going to be fun. Um, and that's also not going to be fun when we let in 2019 Alabama's with multiple losses and things like that. But we always felt like 4 was not enough just because you had 5 major conferences. And this is actually, I want to emphasize, it's kind of the result of conference isolation that's happened as a result of the playoffs and the structure
Right.
we've been in for a long time. Because I know that's something we've talked about. I know something Andrew has been big on with us too. The conferences are not playing very many meaningful out of conference games. And it's easy to talk about Alabama losing to Texas, but it's not just Alabama losing to Texas in week 2 and getting better, et cetera, et cetera. It's Alabama and Texas are 2 of the teams in the playoff. And Alabama's only loss was to the team that's currently number 3. Nobody else played an out of conference team like really in the top 10 outside. Maybe if you want to put Ohio State and Notre Dame on that list, but if you run it down in terms of the current top 10, Penn State, Missouri, Oregon, Ohio State, Georgia, Florida State, none of these teams played another top 10 in that list. Missouri arguably has one of the better wins because they beat out of conference Kansas State. So Kansas State played one and lost. Um, but by and large, the conferences have highly isolated themselves at the top. And as we've noted a lot with things like the Pac-12 out of conference record, well, the Pac-12 out of conference record looks great on its face value when you talk about the overall record, but they actually only have one win over a team with a winning record, and they're 2-4 versus teams that were 500 or better. Most of your out of conference games have been trying to play down as much as possible for the majority of these teams. And so that kind of, I think, skews a lot of things and how we look at stuff. And the Big Ten, I think, is one thing I wanted to note because I was kind of noticing this earlier, flown under the radar a little bit because not only did Michigan not play out of conference, I mean, the Big Ten did go 5-8 out of conference versus other P5s. Really 6-8. Notre Dame should be included in these lists. I'll note a lot of the Pac-12 lists you see with rankings sneakily ignore Notre Dame because they lost in blowouts twice to them in conference play. But your sum total out of conference wins for the Big Ten was Rutgers over Virginia Tech, Maryland over Virginia, Purdue over Virginia Tech, Iowa over Iowa State, and Penn State over Virginia Tech or West Virginia, and that's it. There is not a single quality, meaningful out of conference win from the Big Ten either. And now I will say there's not a lot of good Big Ten teams that lost. The losses Indiana, Minnesota, Northwestern, Michigan State, Purdue, Nebraska, Wisconsin, Illinois. Those are not good teams. Probably the worst was Wisconsin and Washington State at the beginning of the year.
And even that
But
was completely mirrored with Washington State kind of diminishing over time. They lost a ton of depth, so that result just kind of became nullified almost.
right, yeah. So I mean, we've by the way, people take the perspective of ranked where they are at the time, ranked to the end. I don't think you can take either one of those and say this is the way you're ranking it. You do have to look at. My view has always been quality of team you played at the time, which is subjective, but it's the only right way to look at it. Washington State was a much better team to start the year than they were at the end of the year.
That's true.
And conversely, I will say like TCU, Colorado, I don't care where TCU was ranked at the beginning of the year. They're a 5-7 team because they're a 5-7 quality team. Um, so the kind of ultimate breakdown of all this stuff is complicated, and I just say all this to say we're in this situation in large part because I think in view of the playoffs the top teams stopped playing other top teams because they didn't want the Texas Alabama situation to occur, and that meant when we got to this result that we have at the end of the year here, it's really hard to sort through, and so we kind of it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. We need the expanded playoff because we set ourselves up to need the expanded playoff. And the playoff that was supposed to bring more parity through college football, I think it's just brought more ambiguity, frankly, than anything during the regular season. And we get some clarity at the end of the year, and that's where I think it gets a little hard to ignore that the SEC is 16-3 versus other conferences, which no one else is even remotely anything like that in the actual playoff. And some to some degree history comes into play. I apologize. We had some people tab and untab themselves, so I'm kind of trying to keep track of it. I think One Tribe Unconquered, an FSU fan, is up next, and I think an FSU voice deserves to speak, even though we got an ACC guy. I think they'd probably argue bias for a Clemson-related person, so I'll let you on now.
I don't know. They may deserve to speak, but where do they stack up in the power ratings? Are they better than other competition?
Yeah, actually, I'm gonna have to put you behind the other speakers because your quarterback's hurt, and therefore, you've got to be ranked lower. But no, go ahead. If I don't know if you have a question or a comment.
Yeah, I just want to say I haven't missed a Florida State football game in 25 years, and it's really a hard day because I've never imagined a situation like this. A football team is not based on one player, and I've always kind of thought of these people, even in ACC. They say there's an SEC bias, there's a Big Ten bias, and it showed its true colors today because we weren't going to be playing with a third string quarterback. You were going to have the second string quarterback back. And it really stuck a heart in the kids that played, that stuck around, that wanted to play for a championship. And I think it's just a travesty of college football. I always thought there was a shred of integrity in college football, but now I realize there's not. It's an invitational. It's not a. This is an invitational that you guys are playing in, and I'm just completely despondent. I'm very irritated, and I don't think that it's not fair at all. I think I think I'm going to tune out of college football. It's the only sport that I really watch, but I'm just in disbelief, and I think that it's just a travesty. And it took Mike Norvell 3 years to build this roster. So it's not like you can say you can get him again next year, Tiger. We don't have the roster that Georgia does. We don't have the roster. We're not loaded with 5 stars in and out. And so for them to say, you'll just come back and get him next year, it ain't going to happen. Maybe 25, 26. But it's just a travesty for what they did to Florida State. And I'll leave it at that. And thank you guys for leaving me on the platform. But I'm just completely disenthralled with all of college football now. And by the way, there's two SEC teams are in the final this year, Texas being one, and Alabama. And then you have one Big Ten team. Money talks and bullshit walks.
Interesting comment there at the end. That's pretty fun. Yeah, I mean, it's a tough situation. Somebody was going to get left out that arguably was a shame, and I think what ended up really ultimately happening is we finally ran into the year where we didn't have enough slots for the number of teams that should have been in, and so you do end up in a situation where somebody that should have been in is not. One thing that I always push back on is this idea that the money drives the selection. I don't buy that. If you look at who's on the committee and who's making these choices, one, this year, if anything, the SEC had a strong argument of a lack of connection. There's only one, maybe two people on that committee that have any real connection to the SEC. It was dominated by West Coast guys, which you actually could make an argument that the rankings have been skewed in favor of the Pac-12 as a result of who's on this particular committee. But the other thing to bear in mind is they have no real connection whatsoever, anyone with ESPN. And the committee members are associate ADs and things, and they care a little bit about the money, but they care about the money from the perspective of they want the playoff to be successful and things. But they're not really searching for revenue. They're just not. It's not the motivation of the particular people on that committee, if you want to look at it that way, and whatever their personal biases are. Money is probably the hardest argument to make. But I do think the Florida State angle being better is completely justified. I think Florida State completely got screwed. But the question is, did they get screwed by the ranking or did they get screwed by the situation? I would argue it's more the latter. They were screwed by the situation where we had 5 Power 5 teams and we have 4 slots, and that was never going to work. There was always one year it was going to happen. The good news is, the 12. Two good things in the 12-team playoff. First, it's going to resolve this situation going forward. So then, to the extent you're dejected, at least you know that in the future they can't completely screw you. So I think your point is very well taken that this was Florida State's year with their current roster and the way they're building it. And the second thing is, I have always been opposed to major expansion, but the reality with opt-outs and whatnot has slowly gotten me to the point of accepting that this is what we're going to have to do. And again, just like how the playoffs have created isolation, which kind of created this problem because we don't have enough interconference data points, it also has meant that the other bowls have just imploded. And I think we had this half-hearted playoff structure that wasn't really fully thought through, and they realized that. I think 12 is an overreaction because my main concern is I don't think it's going to be very competitive, but it is going to actually cause us to be able to see Georgia and Florida State play each other and get a better idea of who the 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th teams are at the end of the year, given that the committee can't necessarily get it right. And again, normally, I've always also made the argument UCF never wins if they have to play Alabama in round one because they were number 8 in 2017 rather than Auburn. The Boise State was actually the higher ranked team versus Oklahoma. It's one of my favorite facts that everybody misses. Oklahoma was favored in the game, but only by about a touchdown.
Yeah, it was like 7 points.
Yeah, but Boise State was the higher ranked team in the BCS. Everybody remembers it as a massive upset. It actually wasn't. And so, those are going to go away. You're not going to see Boise. I think it was like 10 versus 9 in that game. Instead, you're going to see Boise play Georgia. And I think they're going to lose those games. And I think it's going to make the divide feel worse, frankly.
That's
But
been my that's been my pitch. Is like everybody says that it'll be a recruiting boom for the group of five. Like UCF can sell recruits on, hey, come here, we make the playoff. But I don't know what the pitch is. Like, come here, and we can have a shot at a Peach Bowl or a Sugar Bowl instead of in an expanded playoff. Come here where we can be 22-point underdogs to Alabama in the first round of the playoff. I don't get it.
yeah, in the examples I always throw out are Michigan State, Washington, teams that made the playoff in a one-off that were building almost always lost in blowouts. Cincinnati lost in a blowout. That was 2 years ago. Cincinnati might be the worst team in the Big 12. Like, it has not, absolutely has not helped those programs to get in the playoff and lose in blowouts. It has not. And those are
Even
programs too.
Michigan's recruiting didn't get better after they made it. It's the same with Michigan State and Washington, like you said, Cincinnati.
So I'm skeptical of all that. And then I'm going to flag something Andrew Percival said before I flip to, I think Lee is the next one on the list here. And then there's a number, and I'm sorry, you guys a bunch of you added at once, so I'm going to have a hard time doing it in the right order. But Andrew said, noted in he does a very comprehensive conference hierarchy per metrics and looking at non-conference, basically pure distillation of non-conference performance, looking at all the different conferences. SEC is the clear number one. There's a close rating between the Pac-12, Big 12, and the Big 10. Slight edge to the Pac-12 for second, third, and fourth. And ACC is clearly number five. And that, again, highlights what I was noting before, and I've said in a couple. The ACC had a weird deal where they played a lot of the worst teams in other conferences. Like, the record versus the SEC is really good, but they got 4 wins over Florida, South Carolina, and Vanderbilt. They played Florida, and
Played
into the
Indiana on the Big Ten.
right. They played the bottom of a lot of conferences. It's just the way it shook out. We won 2 games against the South Carolina team that wasn't very competitive within conference. But if you actually adjust for what would be expected for those conferences, and we've seen with our metrics, versus it's like when if you were to play Vanderbilt within conference versus how Wake Forest did and that kind of stuff, it actually makes the ACC look worse when you adjust for that relative to conference strength. So there's just something I want to note again why Florida State ended up out. And there's a bunch of people stacked up, and I'm going to try to get to them as quick we are. And I'll say this as I go through the list. Guys, making a comment or a question, but we can't stay on here forever. So, brevity is the soul of wit. The faster you guys can get the comments out and we'll respond to them, the more people will be able to get to. So I just ask that you guys all keep that in mind for the sake of each other. But with that, I'm going to try to put Lee on because I know you've been waiting, I think, the longest. All right, Lee should be live if you want to unmute.
Yeah, thanks, Josh. I just kind of wanted to talk about the deserving versus best argument that is going on right now. And I'm a Bama fan, so let my bias be known at the beginning. But most of the people that I'm seeing are having it as black and white, one or the other. It can't be both, and that's confused me for the entire playoff era. Is why can't it be both? I've always seen deserving as a more pass-fail thing, not a sliding scale of more deserving. After a conference championship week, you have your pool of the teams that deserve a shot, and then from there you pick the best. It's you either deserve it or you don't. And then I think this year just came down to the injury, obviously. But I agree that I think you and Daniel were talking about this, that even if Travis wasn't hurt, it should at least be a discussion with the schedules between Bama and Florida State, which one of the other guys said correctly, it's not FSU's fault. The ACC is bad this year. They tried to schedule out and schedule tough. But my main point is just I don't understand why best and deserving has to be so black and white. It has to be one or it has to be the other. I've never seen it that way. I've always seen it as both. And that's what I got.
Yeah, that's a fair comment, and I'll piggyback. I don't have a lot to add on that, but I can piggyback to another point. A lot of people have brought up strength of record as a big argument because Florida State's third on FPI strength of record, Alabama's fourth. It gets really hard to unlink strength of schedule, strength of record, quality from each other, because what is most deserved if not measuring your performance against your schedule, and your schedule is based off strength of schedule, which I've always repeated this point, and it's a big thing for everybody on here. I want to educate as many people as I can on this. Strength of schedule is a very particular metric that measures something specific each time, and Sagarin's strength of schedule measures the difficulty of an average team going 500. So basically, the difficulty of making a bowl. We often use FEI's elite strength of schedule, or ELS, which is from Brian Fremeau, and it's basically what would an elite team, number of losses expected for an elite team. And the importance of that is, let's say you play 9 junior high teams and you play 3 NFL teams. It's really easy to make a bowl. It's really hard to go undefeated. And so you have a very, very high ranking in ELS, and you'll have a very low ranking in Sagarin. And a lot of people don't understand just how much that fluctuates. So, like FEI, he does an average team, a good team, an elite team ranking. Florida State's ranking is 29th for an average team, and it goes all the way down to 60th for an elite. Basically, Florida State played a lot of teams in like the base somewhere around the 25 to 50th band in overall quality. And for a good team or an average team, that's a pretty hard schedule, reasonably hard. But if you're an elite team, those bands you rarely lose. And so the strength of schedule drops and drops and drops because they just did not play hardly any teams in the top 20 of overall quality outside LSU was really it. Alabama's average was average schedule strength of schedule is third, good team schedule second, elite was sixth, and so it kind of makes it almost impossible to compare the two. But in that, with that in mind, and you look at strength of schedule and FPI, Florida State's 55, Alabama's 5. It's actually kind of weird to me that they have Florida State it's a third strength of record and Alabama fourth, given that there's a chasm in their own metric between the strength of schedule between the two teams. And now their SOR is looking at the odds of an average team having the same record as you. So an average top 25 team, and I've never known exactly what that means, if it means like the 13th best team or if it means the 25th best team. But what are the odds of it's probably somewhere around like the 20th best team going, in their case, undefeated with Florida State schedule versus one loss with Alabama's. And they said it was harder to go undefeated with Florida State's. But anytime, especially you do undefeated, odds of going undefeated statistically get really screwy because that's basically from that metric, it's a perfect record versus Alabama has a wart and then it gets calculated kind of differently. And I see you, conference commandos, unmuting, and I know you're a little more X's and O's guy, but I imagine you probably have thoughts on that as well. Like the whole SOR, SOS quality, I don't think it can be uncoupled, but I also think some of the results we see are kind of weird from a metric standpoint.
Yeah, I just had one point, and then I really wanted to give you a prompt of a question to answer metric wise, because I think the debate between Alabama and Florida State for the final spot just so severely lacked in nuance. Like everybody was saying, oh well, Alabama would beat Florida State, or they'd be favored by 16.5 on a neutral field, which is all true, but I just don't care. Like this is a sport where results and games have to matter. But I think what was I gonna say? I totally just blanked.
Well,
I'll
that's
just
fine.
ask my question then.
Sure.
The FBI strength of record seems to be super, and really like all SOR metrics seem to be super skewed towards just undefeated records. But my question would be, is it because to me it seems Alabama going 12-1 on that schedule seems a lot harder to me than Florida State going 13-0 on theirs. And I think you tweeted out like Florida State's Alabama beat Auburn. That would be like Florida State's best win
It'd be
or
their fit. So Auburn was
whatever it
the
was.
seventh hardest game that Alabama had played, and in that same bracket, Florida State had only played 4 teams within that quality range.
Yeah, my argument was just that I blanked on was that Alabama going 12-1 on their schedule was not just harder, it was way harder than Florida State going 13-0 just from a power rating and just comparative schedule perspective. I mean, even wins like Kentucky and Auburn were probably fourth, fifth, sixth best wins or whatever for Alabama. Florida State didn't. I mean, Florida State's got one win over LSU, and Bama's got that win. I mean, I would have put Florida State in, but I see an argument for Bama just off of a merit perspective. I just think merit just gets attributed to just blind records.
Yeah, well, and this again, it has to do with statistical weirdness of being undefeated, because going undefeated theoretically is hard statistically, regardless. But it also means there's not any sort of wart on the overall record to bring you down or to say why it should be lower in any way. Another one that's interesting when you bring that up is LSU. LSU went 9-3, and in strength of record, LSU is one spot before Liberty, and Liberty is actually a spot before Iowa, 2 spots before Louisville, and 3 spots before Notre Dame.
Which is weird because Liberty's in the 130s in strength of schedule, right?
Right. Yeah, they're terrible. They didn't play Power Five out of conference, and I'm not even sure who their best opponent is. I mean, I'm gonna read it through in a second because it's worth people
Did they play
without.
Western Kentucky? Maybe.
Yeah, that's probably their best win. It's Bowling Green, New Mexico State. That's actually probably
Yeah.
it's either
Okay.
Western Kentucky, New Mexico State, Bowling Green, New Mexico State, Buffalo, FIU, Sam Houston, Jacksonville State, Middle Tennessee State, Western Kentucky, Louisiana Tech, Old Dominion, Massachusetts, UTEP, and then they played Mexico State again in the bowl. Most of those teams are in the bottom 40, bottom 30 to bottom 40 in the country. Most all of them. And so when you compare to like Notre Dame, who lost 3 games to Ohio State, Louisville, and Clemson, it gets really screwy because a team that they also beat USC in a blowout, they beat Duke. I think it's entirely possible to have a team that could go undefeated with Liberty's schedule and could not beat any of either's teams ever, right? Would never beat USC, would never beat Duke. Um, and it's just really hard when the schedules get that disparate. I think the strength of record just as a metric, frankly, I think it breaks. And that's the nature of a lot of stuff. And again, it's really overcomplicated because of scheduling disparity. And I'm going to bring up one more point before I get to the long stack of questions here, because I really wanted to make this clear. Something that everybody always has to keep in mind when you look at power ratings metrics. I don't care if it's our model. We talk about this with our model. We disclose it. We talk about why we don't always trust it. But with other models too, it doesn't matter if it's FPI, SP plus, FEI. Not everybody admits that you just can't control conference to conference. There are not enough interconference data points, especially right now. The top thirds of the conference almost never played each other. You had Texas playing Alabama, you had LSU playing Florida State, and kind of sort of Notre Dame was the glue that held everything else together, frankly, for the entire rest of the country. And so what ends up happening is if everyone's isolated, is essentially by default, everybody's average conference rating is going to be 65th in the country, right? Like the average team is going to be 65th, because if I don't have any data point to compare the Big 10 versus the Big 12, and I don't use recruiting rankings, by default, the computer is going to think the base team is 65th in the country, and it's just going to spread you out top to bottom based on how spread you out are as a conference. And I say that because a lot of people flag that Michigan, Ohio State, and Penn State 1, 2, and 3 in FPI. And what I think that really reflects is the fact that the Big 10 is incredibly top heavy this year. And so Michigan, Ohio State, and Penn State, by virtue of the fact that they dominated the rest of the conference, really kind of pushes them up in a way that's very hard to do for like Alabama and Georgia, because in the middle of the SEC, middle to bottom of the SEC, frankly, there's a lot more quality. Teams through 4 through 8 are much more competitive in the SEC than they are the Big 10 this year, just the way it is.
Yeah, we
And
talked about last year, and it was a little better this year because out of conference, at least for some of the teams, was a little better. But last year, the top 3 Big Ten teams, I think you actually tweeted this, but it was last year, so I don't remember. Ohio State, Penn State, Michigan's resumes were entirely circular and just dependent on each other. It's just hard to, with the conference isolation and just
yeah,
bad strength of schedule, it's just hard to evaluate.
yeah, and we're not quite there, but again, it actually sketchy because you got Penn State that beat a really bad West Virginia team as that data point, and your other one is Ohio State with Notre Dame, but that was a very close game that Ohio State very easily could have lost, and Notre Dame is not that good. But Ohio State ends up number 2, and Notre Dame ends up 10. So it is, yeah. Computers can tell you a lot of things, but we have always argued they do a much better job of giving you a rating within a conference than they do comparing outside conferences, and that's the thing I kind of want to end with this. You should never really trust these computer rankings when you're trying to compare the quality of two teams in different conferences with radically different schedules isolated within the same conference. And by extension, that does mean strength of record stuff is equally bad, if not worse, because the strength of record stuff is based on the FPI quality and how it uses that to determine the odds that you win a given game. So, at some level, this is a sport where you just can't remove eye test, is what it comes down to. And if you watch our previews, we're like half eye test, half metrics, even though we're a very heavy analytical channel. And the reason for that is we understand well enough that you can't rely on eye test or ratings in the abstract. And what we're always trying to do is find an analytic that makes whatever take we have some justification, so it's not a hot take. But you just, you can't go a whole lot more than that, and that's just sort of the nature of it. So let's flip through it again. We've been long-winded, but let's try to get burned through a bunch of questions in a row. And I apologize, this is probably going to be in essentially a random order, but that is what it is. All right, Longhorns guy, you're up if you want to unmute and make your comment, question, whatever you got. Going once. Longhorn guy. Burnt orange buzz. Going twice. 3 times. All right, I'm gonna move on for the sake of time. If you want to ping back in later, feel free to. Weird. I think it actually. Try again. It was actually, I think, bugged. It may not be. All right. Yep, I think it bugged out. I'm gonna put Grant. I think you've been waiting a while. He flagged, so you're around. So you waved your hand. That works. You're gonna feel free to ask your question or make your comment.
Yeah, hey, sorry. I am a Longhorn fan, so I guess this will fill in for that other guy that didn't make it. As a Longhorn fan watching and waiting this whole, last 24 hours to see if we got in or not. Everyone's saying, that big win that we had against Alabama is the reason we got in. My other question is, if we would have lost, or I guess played poorly yesterday against Oklahoma State, does Alabama still get in over Florida State if Texas would have played poorly?
It's an odd question, and we'd actually kind of debated this. And I had noted in our live show last night, I actually thought Alabama was going to have a better shot if Texas won than if they did. Like in many ways, if they did, like if the scenario you were talking about played out, because I felt like having the three teams in front of them created this quandary. Because as we said at the start of this, everybody has forgotten the reality that if Alabama had lost, we would have had this exact same argument with Texas and Florida State. If Georgia had won, we would have had to do this, hash this out on Texas and Florida State, and that was a hard conversation. So, as I said on Twitter, I was the one that noted it. The moment they said Texas was 3, I knew Alabama was 4, because Texas put them in a position of having to say, look, we don't think we could put Florida State, undefeated Power 5 champion Florida State, over Texas. And the moment they crossed that bridge, um, you know, that Rubicon determined we've already established the undefeated Power 5 champion doesn't have to be in. So now Alabama's going to be in. And Alabama and Texas, I think, kind of got attached to the hip. I do think the committee was struggling with that head-to-head issue the whole time. And putting them both in kind of absolved them from having to deal with it. But if Texas had been really bad in that game, won by a narrow margin, looked really ugly, then they are in a much more difficult position, because they've got to argue Alabama versus Texas versus Florida State. And I think it probably comes out where you're more like maybe you're Alabama 3, Texas 4, but I don't think they wanted to be Alabama 3 and Texas 4. And if you don't let them jump, maybe Florida State comes out ahead. So I think a lot of things factored in this decision psychologically. And I think they had to sort of, every little piece of it fleshed out the way they thought about it. But that was a good question, Grant, so I appreciate it. All right, going to the next request. And I'm assuming this is order. I'm gonna click on the Happy Hawaiian. I know maybe done a couple people. He's followed us religiously for the past several years, so I'm happy to have you on. And feel free to unmute and come out with whatever your comment is.
You calling me Happy Hawaiian?
I did,
Okay,
Mr.
yeah,
Turtle.
awesome. Yeah, big fan of you guys. Yeah, I was thinking about it in terms of what happened last year with the TCU versus Alabama debate. In terms of one team was clearly better. I think Saban even made the argument that like who would Vegas pick, and they had two 1-point losses to highly ranked teams that came on the last play of the game in each game. So their two combined losses were 1 point, were they were left out for. Had scar tissue, I think, from that TCU blowout. And I kind of think this is a reaction to that, because I saw someone else was tweeting that the coaches in the room were arguing that who would you rather play, and kept hammering that point home, which is I think the point that Saban was making last year on
Yeah,
TV. So I think they incorporated some of that. I don't know what your thoughts are on maybe this is a reaction to last year, and in my opinion, maybe they're going back to their criteria versus their actual stated criteria of strength of schedule versus maybe some of the more political factions.
yeah, I think that's an interesting point, for sure, because I do think I don't know how much last year factors in. It's funny, we talk about the blowout in the championship game, um, but at the same time they beat Michigan, so I feel like it actually kind of cut both ways, to a certain degree. But you know the the reality is, leaving Alabama out last year hurt, I think, a little bit, because of what they did Kansas State, who'd beaten TCU, and you felt like maybe that's one of the better teams. I do think the conversation changes a lot when you lose like 2 games. And Alabama with one loss to number 3 Texas is very different than last year's Alabama team that lost to a Tennessee team that was good but not necessarily elite in the year, lost to an LSU team that was very good but not necessarily elite, versus this Alabama team that only lost to an elite team, in week 2. Um, but I do think it matters. I'm looking at the spreads right now on DraftKings, and for the 2 playoff games, Michigan's favored by 2, Texas is favored by 4.5. Those don't necessarily shock me. And yeah, the spreads actually get really weird. They have it projected out I guess they have if all 4, if they were to play whatever combination were to happen. So Alabama would be favored by 2.5 over Texas in a rematch. Michigan would be favored by 3 over Texas, which leads you to the other conclusion. Alabama's favored by 6 over Washington. Michigan's favored by 6.5 over Washington. So basically, Washington and Texas are considered the weaker two teams. Alabama and Michigan are considered the better two. And in terms of power, power ratings, it actually comes out Michigan is the best team in DraftKings view. Alabama's second, Texas is third, Washington's fourth. So pretty different set of metrics. And the record argument versus quality argument does reflect the fact that you've got the two best teams in the 1 and 4 slots playing each other, which has happened several times already this year. There are a couple other sort of fun ones. LSU's playing Wisconsin, which kind of sucks, and they're -10. What I was looking for, I haven't seen all these, and maybe some people have, so forgive me if you have. I don't know if the Florida State line is up yet, or I haven't seen it with Georgia. And I'm gonna
13.5 to Georgia is what I
What
saw.
did you say that LSU Wisconsin line was?
-10 LSU.
I thought you said -4. I was about to say that's the biggest free money I've ever heard.
No, -10. I'm actually surprised. Honestly, it's not higher. Given
Yeah, me
that
too.
I'm not sure Wisconsin is. The thing with LSU is their defense is terrible. But the problem with a terrible defense when you play them is you've got to be able to efficient enough to continue scoring anyway. A lot of offenses, even when they play a bad defense, they mess up enough or they don't execute well enough to score anyway. And
Yeah, I'll
that's
always bet against the Phil Longo inefficient red zone offense.
right. And that's kind of the problem for Wisconsin playing LSU. But yeah, no, it's all an interesting point. And again, 13.5 for Georgia. And bear in mind, I mean, Vegas isn't going to change that money with opt out. So I guarantee you Vegas is factoring in, yep, I see it now, 13.5 Georgia over Florida State. They're factoring in the fact that Georgia's probably going to have a bunch of players opt out of that game. They've got a lot of high end draft pick guys like Buck Bowers. It won't shock me if some of them play because of the character who they are. But the reality is I think most of them probably will opt out, and I think they will do that for the right reasons, which is they are hurt, they've been playing hurt, they need to get healthy for the draft, and if they can't get 100% and be comfortable in that, it's better for them long term to not play in that game. I am usually pretty anti opt out, but I do draw the line with guys that would be playing injured in any way.
Yeah, man. Did you see Bowers and McConkey trying to separate yesterday? That running those routes, they were so ginger, it just looked painful.
Yeah, they were not right. They clearly were not right. And look, some of that is Alabama, but the flip side is, Alabama was not healthy in their back end either. It's kind of injury on injury there with, Lawson, Key, McKinstry's out. So in their back seven, they got two guys playing hurt, and a third guy, their top cover corner, is not in the game, and they're playing against people that are hurt themselves. It was kind of rough. But I'm just noting Georgia 14.5, and you have to realize that is with Vegas expecting opt-outs in that game. They still think they're a 2 touchdown favorite. They're not going to give you, the free money or vice versa, and change that necessarily later on just for the sake of opt-outs. They're doing this based off what they figure will probably happen in terms of opt-outs. So I think that says a lot. All right, I'm gonna try and move this along. So we've got a bunch more requests here. Thank you, Happy Hawaiian. Appreciate it. I always appreciate your sports on YouTube and especially on Twitter. Lots of guys right now. So I think Pegasus has been waiting a while. Again, I apologize. I know there've been a bunch, but a lot of you guys added it all at once, and I had a hard time tracking it. So Pegasus, if you want to unmute and bring up whatever you
Yeah, I
wanted
got
to
you.
bring up.
Thank you. I'm a Georgia fan. I have two questions. Do you think it would have been justified to put Georgia over Alabama? If you look at the common opponents between the two, Ole Miss, Tennessee, Kentucky, and Auburn, Georgia beat all of them by more than Alabama. And in terms of net yards per play, Georgia had an advantage in all those games compared to Alabama. And I don't think Alabama definitively proved they were a better team than Georgia. Georgia wasn't fully healthy. Obviously, Alabama wasn't, as you just mentioned. There were also a lot of botch calls by the refs, a missed field goal, the fumble. And arguably, their three most important players were injured: McConkey, Bowers, and Mims. So I just have two questions.
Yeah.
Do you think it makes sense to drop the number one team essentially all year 5 spots due to that 3-point loss where they clearly weren't healthy, especially when that hasn't happened ever in the playoff era? And also, do you think healthy Georgia would be favored over everyone in the playoff field?
Yeah, so those are two good questions. I think the second one's particularly interesting. The first thing I'll note is the comparisons between Alabama and Georgia. They're tough, right? I mean, Georgia beat Kentucky more than Alabama did, but it was 49-21 compared to 51-13. The Auburn game results for those two teams, we talked about it in the preview for the SEC championship game that we did on YouTube. the box scores look almost identical. They're both one-score games. In both cases, Auburn outgained the opponent by about a yard and a half per play on the ground versus Georgia and versus Alabama. Both cases, Alabama and Georgia almost exactly doubled Auburn's yard per attempt average. The differences were third down efficiency balanced by turnovers between the two teams is kind of how they won. And then the odd man out is the Ole Miss game, but I've had to bring this up a number of times. Ole Miss lost two starting tackles between the Thursday before the Georgia game and the third play of the Georgia game. And one of the guys, the left tackle, is a future NFL starter and by far the best player on the offensive line. And they lost the right tackle, and they ended up having to play backup guards at those two spots. Frankly, it broke them. And it's not just been the Georgia game. Ole Miss, for people that didn't watch them until the end, don't understand who they were, because that team, like in the Egg Bowl, the 17-7 game, that was a game Ole Miss would have won probably 42-7 in week 4. And I just don't think people realize that, how crippled they are, because they don't have the depth. Most teams don't have the depth to lose two offensive tackles, but they really only had two offensive tackles. So when they lost those two guys, they were crippled. And give Georgia credit for beating them like you should, a team in that state. But that is what that was. That was Georgia beating a team that was basically a crippled version of themselves. So when you kind of put all that together, I think that has answered a lot of it. I don't know that the resume question is so clear. Georgia didn't have a loss, but they also didn't play nearly as hard of a schedule as Alabama did. Alabama playing LSU, Alabama playing Texas A&M, also played Tennessee, who that is the one game where I think maybe Georgia beat them more clearly by more, but Tennessee also faded late. Uh, so it's just not apples to apples. But ultimately, the real point here is conference championships and champion status doesn't matter. That has been an absolute truth through the entire 14 playoff era. They have always given significant weight to whether or not you're a conference champion. Like the 2017 Alabama discussion was only a discussion because of that weight given. Otherwise, Alabama would have absolutely been in, and it really wouldn't have even been a contest. So that is the other big point. And the reason Georgia fell as many slots as they did is, and the reason it's so unprecedented, is the fact that we have never had this much of a logjam in the top 6. And so there's never been an occasion where a team that went undefeated in the SEC and lost the SEC championship game could fall behind that many one loss and undefeated Power 5 champs. It's just never happened before that we had 5 of them. And so that's why you have that scenario. The other question, which I think is pretty interesting, is what would happen if Georgia were to play these other teams? Where would they be favored? And I think the reality of it is, if Georgia had made the playoff, they would have been the favorite to win the playoff. I think they would be favored over every team in the playoff. They're a very hard matchup for Michigan, just in the style of play they have. And they are a better team than everyone else. So they would have been favored in every game. Personally, I think the 3 best teams in the country in terms of quality are indisputably probably Michigan, Alabama, and Georgia, and then Texas is a narrow 4th behind them. But those are the top 4 teams in terms of quality, no question. And that does get back to the earlier conversation about strength of record versus overall quality. It's clearly not just best team overall, because Georgia was right. Georgia is one of the 4 best teams in terms of quality, I think, period. I don't think there's even really an argument to that. The Florida State 14-point margin is an example of it. Again, noting that Georgia is very likely going to have more team players opt out than Florida State will. But we'll never know. And that is going to be kind of the nicer thing about the expanded playoff. But again, I'll reiterate, we've always said it should go to 6, not 12. And if we'd gone to 6, you would have gotten that answer anyway. 12 is overkill, I think, for the problem that we currently have. I think signing checks and NDAs is probably the next person on the list. I'm going to add you a speaker. Probably going to go maybe another 15 minutes, and that's all. We've been on the air for a while, and I'm going to lose my voice before too long here. All right. All right, signing checks. You want to unmute and let us know what it is you want to talk about?
Hey there. I just want to make a comment about playoff expansion. Personally, I feel like they've been really kind of grinding towards this 12-team playoff in the hopes that it would, keep more elite teams out. And I think what some people fail to realize, and I know you guys have touched on it before in your videos, the more people you let in, the more Alabamas, the Georgias, the Ohio States, they can have a chance to pretty much get a mulligan in the season where you may have not deemed them worthy of playing for a championship. You're going to give them an opportunity as a lower seed to come in and wreck the whole thing. So, I do understand, Florida State fans are rightfully upset. I'd be upset too, but I'm an Alabama fan, so I'm very happy my team is in. But, with the 12-team playoff on the horizon, I don't think this issue that we're seeing this year is going to get any better.
Yeah, and that it is definitely something I appreciate it. We've talked about a lot, and I think you're right. If you were to break down the current playoff outlook, It's a little simpler this year than some years. Again, the automatic qualifier thing, I think it's going to take 2 or 3 years for people to realize how stupid that is, because it's never a good idea, right, to seed anything other than best to worst. And when you say you have to be a conference champion to be one of the top 4 teams, what you are, and the fact that you have to include, currently it's 6 champions. It will probably go to 5 because the Pac-12 is dissolving, so that would mean you would have to have 2 G5 champions in. So it'll probably go to 5. But you actually have the same problem we've been discussing. It doesn't make it go away. It's just there's no Pac-12. Um, you were explicitly saying, right, we are going to make an exception if we agree you are not one of the top 4 teams, but we'll put you in the top 4 anyway, right? So it is only ever going to be a team that everyone says that is not one of the top 4 teams. So we're going to make one of the top 4 teams not in the top 4 and put another team in. Or in terms of putting 5 champions in, it's Liberty is this year, right? Agree that Oklahoma is the 12th best team, but we're going to force Liberty to go in instead of Oklahoma. And it was almost Tulane who had already lost to Ole Miss, number 11, and we were going to put them in. And again, there was a real chance that by rule, if Ole Miss was, let's say they put Ole Miss behind Oklahoma and Tulane to Ole Miss, you would be required to exclude Ole Miss in favor of Tulane by rule. And I just think there's no reason to do that. You are saying we are, because the rule again only comes into place if you agree they're not a 12th team. So you're saying only in the circumstances where we don't think they should be in will they be in. Otherwise, the rule has no effect because they're in anyway. So it's all pretty stupid. But looking at the current slate, you'd have Florida State would play Oklahoma in round 1, which is somewhat interesting. Georgia would have a rematch with Ole Miss. Ohio State would have a rematch with Penn State,
Alabama,
and then
Missouri was
Oregon
a
would play.
projected rematch, wasn't it?
Yeah, Oregon would play Missouri.
Well, that wasn't
And
a
so those are
rematch,
your
but we didn't need to see it in the same conference.
Yeah, so you end up with you end up with 2 rematches in round 1, which is always my annoyance when it always looks great in like week 8. But come the end of the year, it looks a lot different. And after bowls, it usually looks even worse because right now you still kind of don't know if Florida State and Georgia will compete, right? But Florida State gets essentially the gimme game by virtue of being 5, and then Georgia has to play Ole Miss, who they've already beaten. And then when you get through all that, I'm not sure. Going through the total bracket is a pain in the butt. I don't know if anybody's seen it. It's just going to flush out from there. There's a lot of bracket weirdness, and again, the seeding is going to be pretty sane this year because we don't have any automatic qualifiers jumping "quote unquote" better teams, right? Like last year, 2 of your top 4 teams would have been non-champ, would have been teams that should have been otherwise left out. Like Utah had to be in, um, and Ohio State couldn't be in either. So TCU and Ohio State end up being like 5th, 6th. Alabama sitting there at 7, and forget Utah, and then who the other champion was. I think it was Clemson. Actually, had to be number 4. And so what that ends up doing is now you screw up all the seeding because you have some of the best teams at 5 and 6 that play some of the very worst teams. And then you end up in a scenario where number 1 might actually have to play the second best team because they were put at number 5. So the whole thing really screws up with automatic qualifiers. This year looks a little more sane, but you have teams like Ohio State, they get a mulligan. Oregon, they get a double mulligan, sitting at number 8. And all they got to do is, they got to beat Missouri to get into the second round. In 2, this has always been a big complaint. We kind of created the playoff because we had a rematch between Alabama and LSU. If you've looked the last few years, there's usually 2 or 3 rematches in the first round. Like it happens all the time. And I think that's going to be kind of annoying. And it also, in my view, completely negates the value of the regular season. And I don't think people will see that during the regular season next year. But I think after 2 or 3 years, when they realize, hey, that regular season game that was fun didn't end up mattering because they played again, 2 or 3 years later, people just aren't going to care, and that's a shame.
Aren't you excited to see the Red River rivalry or the game or Oregon Washington 3 times a year? So those guys can really fight over bragging rights when Texas and Oklahoma split the Red River in December and October.
Yeah, well, exactly right. Like the game of the century type games. I think if Alabama and LSU knew they were going to play again, I don't know how that would not be the same game. And it's always been a big deal to me, right? The kick six is considered one of the greatest comeback wins in history. But if you were in just the current format, it wouldn't have mattered.
I still
With the 12th
remember your
game, it
tweet
absolutely
on that
doesn't
from
matter.
like 3-4 years ago. Womp womp.
It just that stuff is going to go away, and it'll feel important next year during the season because we won't be that forward thinking. But once we see a number of big games like that get completely negated, I think in years following, it's going to really change the viewpoint. So there's 3 more requests. I'm going to try to get through them. At least you 3 guys right now. So 3323. I'm guessing you're a Michigan fan, just judging by the logo, but feel free to unmute and speak your piece.
Can you hear me?
I can.
I was just going to ask, what are your thoughts on Michigan being favored? Early thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's an interesting point because I do think that's so far gone under the radar from what little I've seen. It is a big deal to me that Michigan is favored. It says a lot about how Vegas views Michigan as a football team. I think it probably says a little bit about how they view Alabama. Um, I think one of the things it notes is that Alabama is a shaky football team week to week. They have not been consistent. They have issues at offensive tackle. They have issues with quarterback consistency. Um, and you can run a little bit on this Alabama team. The last few years, quietly, the end of the season in 2021 and 2022, their run defense was not very good. 2019 was the year that everybody said, oh, if there's a 12-team playoff, they would have made a run in the playoffs. I disagree. Their front seven depth and pretty well devastated that season. They lost both starting inside linebackers to start the year. They did not get them back at the end of the year. And they lost a number of guys in their front four. And the reason they lost to Auburn, it was an Auburn team that ran for about 6 yards a carry in Alabama. They averaged like 3.5 on the year. They ran for 2 yards per carry in Minnesota in the bowl. Is that Alabama's front four wasn't very good. They lost too many guys and too much depth, and they couldn't stop the run. And if you look at late last year, why did Alabama fade against like LSU? Well, LSU, Ole Miss, and Auburn all ran the ball pretty darn well in Alabama at the end of the year. Not recruited as well in the trenches, and you have to always understand recruiting is a zero-sum game. The rise of Georgia has been at Alabama's expense. Georgia has gotten a lot of the big hoss run stuffers inside for smart scheme, and those have often come at Alabama's expense because they're the same guys Alabama would have preferred to have themselves. And I think a lot of what you're seeing is the fact that Michigan probably can run the ball some, at least enough to move it pretty well. And Michigan's defense is very good. And Alabama's offense, even in these wins, if you go back and look at it, they haven't scored a ton, right? Ole Miss, they scored 24 points. They won by a good margin, 24-10, only 24. Texas A&M, they only scored 26. Tennessee, 34. That was a high watermark for them. Auburn, 27. Georgia, 27. Actually, Auburn and Georgia score, I still think it's kind of odd that they're the same exact score, 27-24. So there's a little bit here, Alabama, that it feels like they can't score 28 on anyone with a reasonably good defense. They are very shot play driven. They're very cold based on the fact that Jalen Milroe is a very explosive player, but he's not a consistent player. He's not a very good first and second down player. Doesn't move the sticks very well. Tends to go for deep shots, and this happened a lot against Georgia, and we even tweeted about it live. Had a couple deep shots in that game where it's like, yeah, they were close to completing that, but he actually had a wide open guy for 6 yards, and there was one big one where they threw to Jermaine Burton in the back of the end zone on 2nd and 4,
Yeah.
and they had Law, their wide receiver hybrid, that they'd snuck out of the backfield, and I have to think he had to be one of the primary reads because it was a gadget thing to have him back there, and he was really wide open. And they tried this low percentage shot deep from Milroe to Burton. It didn't connect. And then third down, they took a huge sack and got knocked out of field goal range on 3rd and 4. And what I think people miss is their 3rd and 4 sack issues were directly caused by the fact that they took a totally unnecessary shot on 2nd and 4. And they can't complete it. And they just don't do a good job of consistently moving down the field. And I think that is probably a problem against Michigan. It'll be a couple weeks before we do previews due to family obligations, travel obligations on my part. Um, Sorry, guys. I wish we could be more consistent, but I am a partner in a law firm. Daniel is a very busy guy managing development for a major startup. So we often just get completely swamped with work, and we kind of need a couple weeks break for that. But that is something we're going to talk about. I think it's interesting, and I think there are a lot of people saying Alabama's in because they're the best team, but Vegas just said they disagreed, and I think that's a big, important thing to note.
Man, to your point on Milroe, I swear they ran that mesh rail play like 5-6 times against Georgia, and there'd be a dude on one of the crossers, just like he had finished running his crossing route, and he'd just be sitting wide open in a vacated zone and just staring at him, and Milroe just didn't see him, and he'd finally get it there. It's so funny.
Yeah, there were a couple of those where Milroe threw to the boundary and was like, oh, that guy was really open. And then when I went back to replay, I realized the guy on the boundary was actually a mesh crosser that had gone all the way across the field, had been open for 2/3 of the field, and like he just ran out of space and stood there until Milroe spotted him.
There was
And
that one, yeah. It happened several times. There was that one.
Oh, I lost you. I don't know if it's me or you. I'm guessing it's probably on your end. Yeah, there were a number of times where that happened. And what's bad is those plays, when they run those mesh cross concepts, they'll motion the receiver and they're checking man or zone. So you'll see a guy going motion back and forth. It usually means they're just trying to see if it's man or zone coverage. And if it's man, you've got you've got the crossers to beat man coverage, and there's often a levels concept, meaning a high and a low receiver running to one side of the field. That's the zone beater, because the levels concept is designed to put the corner in conflict in zone, and he either covers short or he covers deep. And most teams teach you that you're really supposed to cover deep because you want to give the underneath throw. It's not a first down. Sometimes in college they cover short because the deeper corners are harder throw. But Milrow weirdly is almost more comfortable with a corner. But it didn't really matter what the opposing team did. Like a lot of times Georgia was in man because they run a lot of man. And so your eyes are supposed to go to the mesh, especially on like second or third and medium. And he still would throw the corner. Like he'd still throw the levels concept.
Yeah, I'm telling you, I
And
felt
that's the kind of thing I think a lot of people don't pick up. I'll let you pick up because it sounds like you got a audio, but I imagine that's what you're talking about. Like
yeah,
he's
sorry,
not
I jumped
he
in.
doesn't really run the concepts right.
Yeah, I'm telling you, man, it looked like I swear I think they're implementing some of the stuff Grubb's doing at Washington with the big shifts because I mean motion isn't new to Alabama, they've always done it, but like because everybody does motion, but they're running a lot more motion it feels like, and I swear it's not helping Milrow at all. At least on some plays it looks like he just can't identify anything.
Yeah, he's done better. At the beginning of the year, he really couldn't find his open man at all. And it was really like the Texas game, really all the way through the first half against Tennessee. It obviously looked like they were going to lose that game against Tennessee. They were down and they looked terrible in the first half. And he could not find the open guy. And then the light bulb that flipped on is at least in that game, he got more comfortable and a little more decisive to where he got better about stepping up in the pocket in the second half. And he got a little better at just saying, okay, I just need to find somebody open, scan the field, find somebody open, and get the ball to him. But they still aren't really reading well. And people talk about progressions and reads. He does progressions, which means you look at one guy, look at the next guy, look at the next guy. He does that. He progresses through the field. The point with a read is what we're talking about now. It's pre-snap, you do a motion and you say, is it man or zone? And depending on that, you figure out, am I going to throw the levels concept or am I going to throw the mesh concept? That's your read. And it basically comes down to where do your eyes start as a passer. That's where they're still quite bad. They don't always make the right read. And so a lot of times they do throw the wrong concept or look for the wrong concept, which is why they have still a decently, probably overly high pressure rate because their offensive line was better than was made it out to be at the beginning of the year. They really were. They had problems at left tackle, but their time to throw was literally the worst in the country. They're still pretty bad at it. But they're having to progress to find the open guy rather than read it, and that is the huge difference between Jaden Daniels, who we've been lobbying for like 4 weeks. Frankly, I think we lobbied it so strong we're probably one of the driving forces for him likely winning the Heisman versus Jalen Milrow. Daniels reads very well. He knows pre-snap where he needs to go with the ball. His eyes go to the right spot. The ball comes out really fast, and it can only come out really fast if pre-snap you're already identifying where it is that I am likely to have the guy open. That's the read part. Alabama doesn't do that, and the ball comes out a lot slower. So even though like the yard per attempt numbers are crazy for Alabama, but in large part it's because Milrow is always his eyes are usually going deep first and then moving shallow. So he's seeing if somebody's deep, and in the occasions where they are, he's going to throw it. And if not, he tends up holding the ball for a while, and a lot of times ends up scrambling, which is where, to be fair, where Jaden Daniels was midseason to late, even kind of into late season last year, in a big progression into this year with his reads. But a
It's
lot of
funny if
times
you
Alabama
notice.
should be reading short to long, and they always read long to short, even when the coverage doesn't dictate it.
Y'all notice? You may have noticed this. Have you noticed how well Milrow tends to do on broken plays? Because Bama has had issues with the center just on snap timing, and Milrow does like super well on plays where, oh well, screw it, the play's broken. I got to roll out to my right, and just chug it deep to somebody because that's his game. He feels awesome about it.
Yeah, it is kind of weird, and I think that speaks to the fact that that is kind of what he's doing, right? I mean, he is rolling out, finding a guy, and chunking it. And so it is kind of ironic that in many ways it helps him. And I've often made this point. I actually think there's a real chance he could go pro early. I don't think he should because in terms of development, he's not there. But his tools are great. The guy is actually very accurate. He's got massive arm power. He's extremely fast. He's
His
in
release
terms of
mechanism is really good.
yeah, when he knows where to go with the ball and he steps and throws into it, he's a rather high level passer. I think underrated in that regard. A lot of his inconsistency metrics come from the fact that he's not really throwing to die, or he's trying to make a contested throw when he doesn't need to, or his eyes come in late or the throw's late. But as a pure passer versus targets, he's really not that raw. He's quite developed. And to your point on broken plays, when on a broken play, it really comes down to your ability to one, evade pressure, and two, make the throw. And he's very good at both. I mean, if he knows he needs to be moving and he can make the throw, he can. Um, and so it's all for him about trying to translate that into things like, the Auburn game. He had two extremely costly situations where he threw the ball past the line of scrimmage. The first time he had a guy open, ran past, didn't need to, and then threw a touchdown. They got called back for 5 yards, caused a field goal. He could have run that play for a first down, or he could have stepped back and thrown it for a touchdown, and he did neither. And then the third down of the Auburn game before the 4th and 31, he scrambled to his left, had a huge amount of green grass, probably would have gotten to inside the 10 at least, if not inside the 5 or the end zone, and he threw 5 yards past, and that took him from like second or 3rd and 26 to like 4th and 31. Those are examples where, in terms of just making the throw, he does really well. And like, he put the ball in the money. That was a incompletion on that third down. Not that it mattered. But the problem is, it's kind of all the other stuff. And I imagine if he comes back, he'll take a huge step forward. But I also imagine the pros are going to look at all that and say, this is a guy that if we can put him on the bench for a couple of years and fix things or get him where he needs to be mentally, he's going to be potentially a very high level passer. I think in terms of tools, he's one of the better guys to come out in the last few years, and his ceiling is first round draft pick. It absolutely is. He's just developmentally not there. One thing I'm going to note before I move to a couple more we've got on the request here before I have to buck off. Actually, the Alabama Michigan line just moved. I'm watching it live on DraftKings. I have the page open, it refreshed, and it's now a 1.5 for Michigan. So interesting. There's already money on the Michigan side. Texas at 4.5. And then kind of interesting that line has actually already moved. Tennessee, Iowa, I think may have just gone on the board. -8 Tennessee. That's kind of interesting as well. Ohio State -6.5 versus Missouri. That's interesting. Missouri is not a touchdown favorite or Ohio State is not a touchdown favorite over Missouri, and Penn State is only a 3.5 point favorite over Ole Miss.
Ohio State, Missouri. I really want to see the line on over under and how many just wide zone runs those teams run, because it's got to be at least 50. Like, it's just ridiculous. That's a crazy fun matchup.
Yeah, Missouri is a team we kind of said all year, from a national landscape and a lot of people's opinions, maybe the most underrated team. And I would say Brady Cook has probably been, I would say, clearly been the most underrated quarterback. Their only losses were to LSU in a shootout where they had a late interception or pick six. It was a 10-point win, but Missouri had the ball driving to win the game. And I believe they threw a pick six instead, which
Yeah.
flipped the score. But that
Yeah,
game
they were
was
down 3.
yeah, they were down 3 and were driving to win. And then Georgia was a 9-point game and a rather close one as well. But like, they beat Tennessee 36-7. Blew out a lot of people. Their worst win was probably Memphis 34-27. They were kind of shaky to start the year. Middle Tennessee State too, but beat Kansas State, who ended up being a very good team early in the year. That's an underrated team, and that Ohio State's obviously favored by a decent margin, but not that much. And I think that probably speaks a lot to where Ohio State's offense is, and it speaks a lot to how dangerous Missouri is as an offense. That is absolutely a losable game for Ohio State.
I think Mizzou matches up really well on the lines in that game. I'll let you get to whoever's requesting. I just think Missouri matches up okay. I mean, that offensive line's awesome. Ohio State's offensive line really struggles. Missouri's got good tackles.
Yeah, it'll be interesting. It'll be interesting for sure. I'll tell you the most. Arizona is a 1-point favorite over Oklahoma. I don't know what that means to me.
Wow.
Yeah, it's kind of weird. I would have thought Oklahoma would have been favored. Some of these lines, Auburn a 1.5 over Maryland. I think that says a lot about where Vegas puts, frankly, that. Penn State is 3.5 over Ole Miss, and again, Ole Miss is a broken team at this point. Probably will have a number of opt outs too. All that to me very quickly with it is starting to add up to saying I don't think Vegas likes the Big Ten. Frankly, I mean, I'm not saying you have to agree with it. I'm just saying that's what Vegas is telling you, is they don't really care for the Big Ten. All right, I'm trying to get through a couple more of these. I'm going longer than I said I would, but I'm enjoying it well enough. Joshua, you've been waiting forever. Joshua C. So I'll go ahead and put you on.
I'm gonna be real quick. I know you're trying to get off, but I just had a couple points I wanted to go after. The first is Boo Corrigan. They saying that Jordan Travis, basically is the reason that Florida State is being kept out of the playoffs. But after the North Alabama game, they dropped the FSU to 5 and said, "Hey, quarterback is not something we're looking at as to why we're going to drop them." So you kind of talked about both sides of your neck there, and then you talked a little bit later about the playoffs going to 12 teams, which you did. You did come back and say that you don't think things are going to change that much, but that's kind of the same place I was coming at it from, because if they can do what they did today, like when we get to 12 teams playoffs, why wouldn't they just justify why it couldn't be 6 SEC teams and Big Ten teams in there? So I go off and let you kind of come in on that.
Yeah, they did talk out of both sides of their mouth, and it's always interesting. I appreciate the comment, Joshua, on that. Part of it is the nature of the spokesman for the committee that I think you always have to keep in mind that Corrigan's job is to try to relay whatever the committee talked about in their closed meetings. And frankly, I don't think they're probably on the same page most of the time. So Boo Corrigan is trying to give you some idea of why the committee did it. But if you've ever, like, I've run a lot of committees, okay, in the firm world, in college, law school, public sector, I've headed a lot of committees, okay? When you're the spokesman or chair of a committee, and you make a statement, you try to make the statement as if the committee has one voice. The truth is, it rarely does. I mean, you almost never really have unanimous consent. You'll get a unanimous vote because you want to be quote unquote unanimous, but people don't agree on it. And a lot of times, the way that you arrive at your conclusions can be really different. And I think a lot of what happens with Buch Oregon is the fact that they probably aren't unified in that approach, and so they get something that they can say that they're behind in terms of getting behind a position. But I think a lot of the vagaries and non-answers you get are because you can only give an answer if everyone in the committee actually agreed with it. And if the committee all had a million different reasons for coming out the way they did, you can't really give one answer on why a team's higher or lower because that answer doesn't apply to everybody. And then the big thing with me with Florida State, and when you talk about Jordan Travis being hurt, I don't really think it was the injury so much as the performance. And what I mean by that is if Jordan Travis had been healthy and they had the exact same results the last 2 weeks, I think they probably would have been out too in that scenario. The thing with Jordan Travis being healthy and being hurt and out hurt them was the impact of Jordan Travis being hurt, almost more than him being hurt per se, because they clearly aren't a good offensive football team without him. And everybody that watched him all year, really even the last year, knew Jordan Travis was the engine that had made that machine work. The athletic quarterback knew the system extremely well and a good passer. He was making them the team they were. And it's clear without them, I think they're just not the same. So I do agree the rationale doesn't make sense in terms of what he said, but I think maybe the way to rectify it in your mind is to think of it from the perspective of they didn't so much drop him because Jordan Travis is hurt. They dropped Florida State because of what they looked like Jordan Travis. And if they had been an offensively dominant team with Rodemaker like they were with Travis, which to be clear, the team that was a team that's in the playoff probably should have beaten Florida by a good margin, then I think they would have viewed it differently. But this has been multiple weeks in a row without Travis where they just don't look like an effective offense anymore. And I think that's probably the ultimate problem for Florida State in this discussion. Joseph, I know you've also been waiting, so I'm trying to add you real quick. I'm talking down on Florida as I add a Florida State fan, or a Florida fan, not a Florida State fan, excuse me. But I'll be curious to hear your take on all this. Just unmute and let us know what you want to say.
Yeah. Thanks for letting me chime in. I have a couple points, and then to end with a question. I'll make it as quick as possible. Yes, I am a Gator fan, but I'm a huge just general college football fan. I thought Florida State should have been in. But a couple points I want to hit with why I think this happened and where it started. Bobby dodging the SEC, I think, is haunting them big time today, especially today. The ACC was pretty bad, and they had an underperforming out of conference opponents, thanks to my Gators. I think the FSU and ACC feud this past summer probably did any favors. Not being a blue blood. These are also things, whether you like it or not. I'm not saying I like all these things. Like you kind of mentioned, they look bad for the past 2 weeks. That didn't help. The Nick Saban street cred, again, like it or not, I think that has a strong impact. And I think this was a big thing that president didn't matter anymore. There's a new system starting next year, so I think they were willing to bite any bullet that they wanted. And this kind of leaves my question, and this may be a hot take. I'm really not trying to make a hot take, but fans not holding Michigan accountable, it's very, very clear that they cheated. And we're all kind of just like, all right, we'll wait for the NCAA to do something about it. But I feel like if there was more noise, only the Big Ten was making noise. If there was more noise, I feel like they were the team to leave out, and they had the biggest black mark against them. And it would be kind of hard for Michigan for the team to say, well, like we won all our games. It's like, yeah, well, you also cheated. And I know you're a lawyer, innocent until proven guilty, but I do have one last point I want to hit on. Is it is kind of nice. I felt like 1993 was given to Florida State So as a Gator fan, I am relishing a little bit, but Florida State should have been in. And I thought the conversation should have been with Michigan, not Alabama or Texas. But I'll leave it to you.
All right, thanks, Joseph. Those are a good set of comments. I appreciate it.
That's a noted member of the Stay at 4 community right there, Joseph.
Damn
I want to
right.
point that out.
You're damn right.
Appreciate it, Joseph. And yeah, we somehow ended up. Well, I think we beat that drum because we thought it was the right drum to beat. But it's fun that we got to know a lot of you guys that had that opinion on expansion. Even though this is the year that most justifies it. Again, this I think it most justifies our position that it should have been 6 and not 4. Not necessarily needs to be. I don't think there's an argument for 12 or even 8. I don't think Oregon needed to be in. But there are a couple points there. One, the Florida State argument. There's actually an interesting thing to me, and I think it says a lot again about why we turned out the way it did. Florida State, if they had joined the SEC, would they be in right now? And I think the answer that people would feel would probably be no.
Their rebuild would still be going.
Right. I don't think a lot of people think that they would have beaten Georgia in an SEC championship game. Maybe people feel like they beat Alabama based on how inconsistent Alabama was. But it is, it's this two-sided coin when you talk about Florida State being hurt by not being in the SEC. Well, you're being hurt by not being in the SEC because of how much it helps you not being in the SEC. Again, strength of schedule, Alabama was 5th and Florida State was 55th. I mean, it just is what it is. And so it made it apples to oranges, and it hurt them and it helped them. Helped them to get to 13, and it hurt them by not making the 13 matter. But those are the two edges of that sword. And to your point, maybe they do get in if they are a team that has won the SEC and they're in that position, and maybe that helps them recruiting and a million other things. Florida State has a lot of problems that people don't often bring up. Financially, they're not overly competitive with a lot of the top schools, and a lot of people don't realize that. There's a reason Jimbo Fisher left. Didn't get the money he wanted to hire assistants. Facilities are way behind Florida and a lot of other schools in that region. Um, I'm not 100% sure, but there's probably an argument that UCF may actually have more booster support at this point than Florida State does, as crazy as that is to say.
All those
And so,
Hilton night managers.
yeah. So, I mean, there's a lot of things there to say, like Florida State would be better off in the SEC, but this just emphasizes the point that if they were in the SEC, I'm not sure what tier of a program they'd really be, right? Like Texas A&M is probably a lower tier program in the SEC than they were in the Big 12. Not to say they were winning titles in the Big 12, but they're struggling to stay in the second tier in the SEC. And they've been often in like a third tier team. And Florida State might be in a somewhat similar situation, and they want to join the SEC, and I think the SEC has some openness to it. But it's a complicated problem because one, when you add a team, right, for the conference teams, when you talk about adding a team, they're one of the main things they're concerned with is revenue shares, right? You're gonna split up your pie for one more slice of pie and give it to that team. So whatever team you add, you want them to add at least one more slice worth of pie. So when you give them their slice, you're not out less, if that makes sense. Um, I don't know that it makes sense to add slices to pie, but you get my point, right? Like they need to add more in revenue than you're going to give up in shares. And usually that comes from like Washington and USC or examples. You add an entire new market in USC and you think you add revenue by picking up the LA market, then you're going to give up an extra 15th share to that team. Florida State actually is kind of in a precarious position because they're not actually that revenue generating. And what's worse, they're in the same TV market as a number of SEC teams. So most of the eyeballs watching Florida State games, yeah, you get the TV revenue of the Florida State game, but the ideal thing for like USC is people in LA might actually watch Michigan, Ohio State, right? You get bonus eyeballs. With Florida State, those fans are probably already watching the Florida game. They're probably already watching the Georgia game and the Alabama game. So the only extra TV ratings you get is the Florida State game itself. And so they're a difficult ad, even more so than Clemson, that I think at least has a more diverse fan base. And I can tell you, there's a billion Clemson fans in DC. I got a bunch of friends that are Clemson fans.
We're everywhere.
Yeah, Florida State isn't really in that same category, and it makes them a weird ad, which is why I've been continually stuck in limbo. So thanks, Joseph. I appreciate it, and I'm just going to go until I feel like stopping. So Jackson, I know you've been asking for a little while. I'll add you as a speaker. Jackson, you want to chime in with your comment?
Yeah. So, all right, first of all, I'm an FSU fan. So this I'm gonna have some bias here.
Condolences.
But I was at the game last night, and leaving the stadium, it didn't even cross my mind that FSU would be left out. Which clearly I was wrong for that. But just as a whole, the one thing that I think people are missing, and this is where you can see that there's clearly a different motive when deciding these teams, is how is Georgia behind FSU? Um, if-
It's the championship status. I'll tell you that right now. The entire. This is the one thing they've been consistent on since 2014. Basically, championship status is worth an extra like win or loss. Being a non-champion is like taking another loss almost. So if you go back and you look at it, situations where they've had two teams with the same record, one's a champ and one's a not, the champ has gotten in every time. If there's any way, shape, or form an argument, they've gotten in every time. And you can talk about like Ohio State and Penn State in situations 16 and 17, but those were like Alabama had one loss, Ohio State had two, and Florida State as the champion is being compared more evenly with Alabama, where Georgia has an extra loss and they're a non-champion. So I can't answer that 100%. That's why the committee did. You can agree with it or not agree with it, but I'm telling you 100% that's why it came out the way it did.
no, yeah, and that it makes sense for sure. I just seeing that ranking just made me think like with Travis out, and I get it. Like with Travis out, the offense looks way different. Um, but the defense rose up when they needed to, and it's not like we won by 1 point or two or three. You won by 10 by a team that averaged over 30, I think. Um, now again, if you get back to like, well, who are they playing? But you're just going to go in full circles with this with every team. Um, but to me, it's like Alabama was in dogfights with teams too, and if they were in September, they were in October, November. At the end of the day, these are all Power Five teams, and if we're going to just do this, then you might as well just put. I think Georgia should be in. Like I'm telling you right now, Georgia would be a better competition than the other ones. So I just, it's like, I feel like you would just do Georgia, Bama, Ohio State, Michigan, or whatever, like whatever the power ratings are, put the top four in and do it that way because it feels like we're in a collusion where there's a mix of eye test and, whatever deserving, conference champ plus record. And you get to this point where it's all a mix and it's confusing. That's what it feels like. It feels very confusing, and I'm just disappointed. And then at the end of the day, like all these teams are gonna play, and there actually are good matchups. So at least we're gonna get two good matchups. But it's like the TCU argument to me is what gets me the most frustrated. I've seen that all like Stephen A. Smith and everyone's saying that. It's like TCU just spread the ball and beat Michigan pretty. I mean, it wasn't easily, but they beat them. And I'm like, well, wait a second. You can't say 65-7 when they just beat Michigan, spreading the ball out, and then they play Georgia, and of course they got stopped. But it's like that's going to happen. That's college football. At the end of the day, their job is to I don't know. I just hate that part of it. And then also Boo Corrigan, like he seems all over the place, which I guess he's kind of in a tough position because he's not the one controlling the power. But it just seemed all over today listening to them talk. And as an FSU fan, it's like, well, damn, I guess we should have looked better. I mean, I guess win by 20, win by 30, or at least have some more offensive touchdowns. Um, but I just don't know what else they were supposed to do. And I guess Bama just, the one loss didn't really matter for Bama at the end of the day. And it is what it is. But that's all I really got. I'm kind of just talking in circles. So thanks.
No, I appreciate it. I mean, if you're a fan, I think you have every right to be frustrated because I do think, as I said earlier, I think Florida State got screwed. The question is, did they get screwed by Alabama? Did they get screwed by the committee, or did they get screwed by the system? I tend to say they got screwed by the current system. They're the fifth P5 champion in a year where there were five deserving P5 champions. Um, and when we talk about getting in and deserving and all, I mean, it is kind of splitting hairs. But things like the 2 point win over Boston College. Boston College is 86th in FPI, and people give a lot of flack to that Auburn win. Auburn's 30th. Okay, so Miami, one touchdown win. Miami is pretty 24th, pretty close to Auburn. It's a reasonably good team that had one horrible day against New Mexico State, who is themselves actually a rather good team, and I think people just miss that repeatedly. Um, but that was really the distinction there. And then when you look through the rest of it, we've broken down on Twitter a number of different ways, the ultimate problem is that Florida State's schedule just isn't very good. And when you talk about Power Five being Power Five, that is one area where we typically will kind of push against because this is a very striated sport, and Power Five isn't necessarily Power Five. And like you can say, if you want to say Auburn's a bad team, then Boston College, some other sort of level, right? That was now you can compare USF to Boston College, which I think what a lot of people would do. But the thing that I think people miss is things like the one score win over Miami, over a back quarterback at Miami, isn't really all that different in terms of a one score win over Auburn. Miracle play aside, it's a one score win and a one score win. Um, And again, the top wins that Alabama had, they just didn't really replicate on the Florida State side. LSU, they both beat LSU by a very similar margin, but the games like Texas A&M, Georgia, Ole Miss, Tennessee, there really weren't teams like that in the range for Florida State that they'd played. Duke was a big one, but Duke, that was kind of a ranking from earlier in the year. They did not, I don't think they were ever really that good. It was us overrating Clemson to start the season and Duke winning a very fluky game against Clemson that caused us to put Duke a lot higher than they really ever should have been. So that's kind of, sorry, conference commandos. I see the sadness as a Clemson fan. But again, if you're a Florida State fan, I think you have every right to be frustrated because you did go undefeated and you did what you could. And what the committee basically came out and said is, yeah, you went undefeated, but you didn't go undefeated well enough. And that's brutal. But again, though, I think the conversation there really hinges around the fact who they were at mid-season was probably good enough that they would have gotten in if they continued playing at that level. Um, and the injury to Jordan Travis means the last few weeks they haven't been nearly the same team. The close win over Miami, the close win over Florida, the tough win over Louisville. That was not the same kind of team that played in the first half of the year, and that was ultimately, I think, what drove. As they said, the injury was the thing that mattered. But what they really mean by that is they had a tough decision in the injury. They went from a Florida State team that would probably be at least within a touchdown of Georgia to a team that, even with Georgia's opt outs, is projected to be about a 2-score underdog. And it just, from the committee's perspective, and again, what we concluded last night, I concluded, yeah, I'd go Texas 3 and Alabama 4 purely for the reason that gun to my head, I just don't think Florida State would be competitive with the top teams right now in the current state. A couple more. Happy Hawaiian requested to speak, and again, you've supported us for long enough and often enough, and I appreciated it throughout. That I'll stick around a little bit and let you chime in if you want to, whatever you had to say.
Oh yeah, so I think just going back to what an earlier speaker said about if Texas didn't beat Alabama, would it actually be Alabama and Florida State and Texas left out? I think that's absolutely the case. And if you look at the way the rankings came out is we're in this endless debate about Alabama versus Florida State, but I think we probably should be talking more about Texas versus Florida State. And if you look at the BCS simulated rankings, since the 4-team playoff started, the 4 that got in would have been the same 4 as ranked by the BCS system, which I did appreciate had some level of computer objectivity in it. The top 4 would have been different ordered some years, but the top 4 would have always been the same until this year. This was the first year that there's a difference, and it was actually Texas and Florida State. So the BCS this year would have had it Michigan, Washington, Alabama at 3, Florida State 4, and Texas 5. So I do think it's interesting that we're having this Alabama Florida State conversation so much when really I think it's Texas that booted out Florida State when it comes down to it.
Yeah, that is. I'm looking at that right now, and it's an interesting point because you're 100% right. The simulated BCS actually puts Alabama even higher at 3, and Texas is the one that drops at 5. A little bit, I think, is the fact that Texas, their worst games came when their starting quarterback, when Ewers was hurt, and they weren't a great team. And in the computers, I know that's hurt them. Just like Alabama started the season, makes them, they're not high even in our own metric. I think what are they right now? 11th, and Florida State's 12th, which has a lot. It's actually Washington 10, Alabama 11, and Florida State 12th in our power ratings. But the problem is Florida State is trended way down, and Alabama has kind of trended up. They were like 15th or 16th. Texas is in a somewhat similar boat, but it's a good point. And what's funny is people complain about the committee, but you go through the simulated BCS. One, to your point, Alabama was in easily in the simulated BCS. Texas is the one that got hurt, and I may even tweet that. That's a great point. Penn State and Missouri flip flop at 9 and 10, and then Notre Dame, Arizona, and Louisville get scrambled at 14 through 16. And otherwise, all the way through 16, you got the exact same list. So there's not really actually a lot in the top 12 that changes. And in fact, you get the same 12 teams in the simulated BCS for the current committee. And Alabama gets in better in the simulated BCS. It's actually Texas that benefited from the current situation, which again goes to something I said at the very beginning of this live stream, if people weren't there, which is Oklahoma State, I think, is the team that people have maybe missed as a puzzle piece in all this because they're not very good. They had a weird schedule where they're the one team that had all 4 of the newbie Big 12 teams, and those were teams that went 4-22 versus everybody else in the Big 12. And they went 3-1 versus those teams, and they got blown out by South Alabama to start the year, and they played Arizona State as their Power 5 out of conference, who's one of the worst in the country. got blown out 45-3 by UCF just 3 weeks ago. Barely beat Houston, barely beat BYU. Those are the last 3 games of this year. Frankly, it's just kind of a fluky thing that they beat Oklahoma based on their quality. And they're 118th in pass defense in our metrics, 65th in rush defense, 97th in pass offense, 42nd in rush offense. They are not good in almost any of our metrics. They're actually, as I said, around 60th. They're just on the verge of being a bottom half team. And so I do think a lot of this reaction from pollsters committee, the way we're discussing, is, well, of course Texas is in because they just blew out Oklahoma State. But when you turn to the computers, they're not shocked by that because Oklahoma State's, again, a team that just got beat actually much worse by UCF a few weeks ago. That was a statement win over a team that probably should never have been ranked in the first place. And so that's, I think, driving a lot of the discussion or lack of discussion. And then I'm going to say, Tim, because I have the chance to do one more speaker and clear the board, you're going to be the last speaker, and then I'm going to get off and stop ignoring the rest of my family for the rest of the Sunday and probably, I don't know, maybe save my voice and play a little Skyrim. But that is my life. Between this and law, I got Skyrim downloaded it on Game Pass when it came out,
That's what
and
I was gonna ask you. That is great.
I think I've managed 12 hours in the game, and it's the only game I've been playing, and I am at least consider myself a gamer, but that's the amount of spare time that I have.
Love
So
it.
yeah, I know this is a labor of love, but man, it's like every hour we record is trying to squeak out for me, and it's just one less hour to do other things. So I may try
Gotta
to.
send you a Skyrim time, man.
Yeah, I gotta. We'll make it work with Starfield. A bunch of other games I want to play. But Tim, do you want to unmute and make your comment?
Yeah, I wanted to ask a question. Do you think that the committee set a bad precedent, even with the 12-team playoff? Do we fear any bad precedent was set?
I don't think so, because I do think it was such a unique situation that came up. Again, people said, I think the real precedent here, right, is no 0 or 1 loss Power 5 champion had ever been left out. And for the first time ever, we had 5 0 and 1 loss Power 5 champions. And the one loss from one of those champions was only to one of the other teams in the playoff. And the closest thing we got to it was when Ohio State lost to Oklahoma to start the year. But Ohio State did go on to lose a second game. And so we've never been in this position. So I don't really see it as that negatively precedential. And frankly, from a long-term perspective, I don't think it's going to be all that significant because we are moving to the 12-team playoff. There's an interesting discussion to be had on whether or not they would have made this decision in the 12-team playoff, because it meant they would have put Florida State at 4th and said, oh, we're keeping or maybe even 3rd, right? And we're keeping the undefeated Power 5 champions at the top, because they didn't have to worry about leaving Alabama out. And the current format forced them to have to make that decision. And frankly, I think the committees are PR driven enough that they might have done that just for the sake of being politically correct, had it been an option. I'm just being honest. I'd like to think, I think the early committees would have made the hard decision regardless. The early committees driven by Barry Alvarez were very, very aware of metrics, strength of schedule, all that stuff. They were actually really good. They consistently did better than the AP poll. I will say right now, for all the beef, go look at the bottom 15 of the playoff rankings in the AP poll, and there are not a lot of differences, but where the differences show up, I genuinely think the committee does a better job. Like the AP poll has Liberty 18th. The committee only has them 23rd. I think that makes sense given just how incredibly weak the record is for Liberty. The committee has Clemson sitting at 22nd. The AP poll did not rank them. They ranked James Madison 24th. They did not, and they've got SMU all the way up at 17th. I don't think either one of those is completely reasonable. Most of the rankings, the rest of the way up, don't really matter too much. But there's a lot of stuff with the AP poll where I think they kind of overrank and underrank, and I think they're a little more driven even by win loss. So I will say the committee generally makes harder decisions, I think, than the AP poll does, and I think they're a lot more attuned to difficulty of schedule. Again, Tennessee being higher ranked, that kind of thing, including Kansas State, whereas the AP poll does not. Putting Iowa higher than the AP poll does, stuff like that. But yeah, I think it does shake the foundations a little bit, and it's going to take a little time to get over it. And I'm going to end with Tim. You had one more thing to say, so I'll let you speak up real quick.
Yes. So I think my fear was the committee this whole time. They placed value in the eye test. this, and I call it the eye test fallacy. I just think it's a measurable, it's a subjective thing. I mean, these amateur athletes, they'll play up and down a competition. We've seen it all the time. But then when they turn it on, they turn it on. And so I just kind of think the eye test, like you saw Oregon going into the weekend, they were placed ahead of Texas, Alabama, and Ohio State due to this eye test, despite the metrics showing that Oregon, in terms of strength of schedule, etc., they were inferior to those other teams. Now they might have been more efficient and whatnot through some other metrics, but their strength of schedule is so bad. How could they not be? And so what I fear is what's going to happen is you're going to see teams more strategic with scheduling, and it might become a race to the bottom in some cases. Maybe not all schools do this, but I think some schools now, like if you're Florida State, why would you ever play LSU again if it didn't matter in the end? Now I know why FSU was snubbed, and I understand it to a degree. Um, but I just don't see the incentive anymore. I mean, is it good for recruiting? Yes. Is it good for revenue? Yes. But if your goal is to make the 12-team playoff in one piece, why would you play blue blood or tough Power Five non-con when you can play a really, like an S?
Yeah, I think those, and it cut out a little bit on my end, but I got the gist of it right up to the end. So let me try a couple responses to that, and then I'll wrap this thing up. I appreciate it, Tim. Those are great comments. The first thing to note is in regard to where Oregon's at and eye test and everything. I think it's important to remember that Oregon right now is still kind of adored in a lot of computer metrics. They're number 2 in our metric. And so it's kind of funny that we were lobbying for the fact that Oregon shouldn't be so high, but they're number 2 in FEI. They're number 2 in our power ratings. Washington's 8 in FEI. Alabama's 11. So as much as ours seems weird, it's really not. We're actually consistent with a lot of other ratings. FPI, the reason FPI has these things flipped a lot more is FPI takes into account recruiting rankings and priors in a lot of their stuff, and so that makes the ACC kind of be buoyed in a way that a lot of the other systems don't do nearly as much, or maybe totally phased out at this point in the year. But Oregon, in terms of objective matrix and eye test, was better. Our concern is this other more insidious point, and this is where I think you need people that understand the sport better. And it's the scaling issues that exist in college football. Oregon was built, in my opinion, to beat up on bad teams. They are a spread-based offense. They have a lot of speed. They have a mobile quarterback, and they've got a lot of speed on defense. And the thing with Oregon is when you play a full schedule versus teams that were mostly inferior teams, right? And Washington, look, I think they totally deserve to be in the playoff. I'll be honest. I'm very, very hard pressed to say they're one of the 4 best quality teams in the country, but they're at least pretty darn good. And when Oregon played lesser competition, and Oregon State and FEI is the only other Pac-12 team in the top 15 in our metric. Oregon State's all the way down at 17, USC's at 16, Arizona's at 15. Against those teams, and this is what I'm going to end on, I think there's still an advantage in playing more difficult games. And this is ultimately why I think Georgia lost the SEC championship game. And that's if you don't play high level teams, you don't learn certain things about your own team. Alabama's difficult schedule was directly responsible for a lot of the things they did right in the game against Georgia that made them win. And I think Georgia's relatively weak schedule is the biggest driver for them doing a lot of the things they did wrong versus Alabama. I mean, there were a lot of stuff in terms of what Alabama did schematically where they had adjusted their offense based off realizing that Jalen Milroe has certain skills in terms of progressions and deep throws, and then they have a lot of troubles in terms of their ability to make reads in a more complicated scheme. They wanted to be more play action, read based offense beginning of the year with 3 quarterbacks, and they really had to retailor that to Milroe and his fits based on the challenges they had running the ball against better competition. I don't think Georgia got challenged the same way. And I think defensively, there are some personnel issues that maybe they would have done a little bit differently, schematic issues they would have done differently. And I think offensively, this is like the second or third time I will say, we talked about this a long time ago with Jake Fromm, and it bit them in 2017 in particular. They tend to do what they need to do to be an efficient offense. And they don't always learn, hey, we can't operate this way against a better defense and move the ball well enough to win. And if they played better competition, I think they would have been strained and say, okay, we need to open this up more. And Smart had already gone through a cycle of learning, hey, we can't be this conservative. We've got to learn 2018 in particular, right? They took a lot of the training wheels off and they said we've got to be more aggressive all year because if we try to get to the end of the year playing this style of offense up on bad teams and just be conservative and play ball control, we're going to get to the end of the year, need to throw it, and we won't know how. And so I think that's the reason you play good out of conference teams, especially if you're in a bad conference or a weak conference, because I do think personally a lot of those Ohio State teams, I think they lost their playoffs, the games that they lost because they were facing teams of a certain quality offensively or defensively for the first time in a playoff scenario. And I think there were a lot of bowl games where Ohio State would have won had they played a couple more better teams and figured some stuff out because they were actually more talented and in a neutral situation would have been the better team. But because they would face like an SEC team, and I think a lot of times the SEC teams have gone through a gauntlet. So one, it's filtered out teams that are talented but don't have all the right pieces. But two, you have teams like LSU in 2019. They had a bad defense for most of the year, and it took them all year to figure that out, figure out why it was bad, figure out get the right pieces, learn to be better. They got the offense really honed to a point, and so you face these SEC teams that have gone through enough of a gauntlet that they're machines come playoff time, and a lot of the other conferences, and I think Texas it could be a challenge. I think Michigan could be a real challenge for them. Michigan's going to face an Alabama team, offensively and defensively both, that are going to present things they've never seen. Offensively, Alabama's on not just better, they're on a different planet than anything Michigan's seen. And I'm not saying Alabama is a dominant offense, but their talent level across the board is just better. And Ohio State had a better receiving core, no doubt, and they've got maybe better skill position players, but they have some serious issues at offensive line and quarterback that hold them back to a significant degree. Alabama doesn't have that. And so Michigan may learn some things about their secondary and schemes that they haven't seen, and it may cost them in the playoff. And if you're Michigan, you'd much rather face, I don't know, play Texas in week 2 or 3, lose that game, get in the playoff, and the lessons you learn to get Texas will let you win the playoff game, and you can win a title. So I think that's a benefit that Alabama had in playing Texas. Now they maybe didn't need it with the SEC schedule they had, but it's a benefit they had that a lot of other teams didn't have. And so if I were to argue for why you need to still play good competition, it's that if you want to win a title, it's easy to say, oh, we need to make it as easy as possible so we get in the 12-team playoff. But at the end of the day, you still got to win the 12-team playoff. And the teams that have played good competition before, I think, will have a really significant advantage because they're going to get into that playoff slate and they're going to be more comfortable playing other high-level competition. Whereas I think this is always the problem for like a G5 or Cincinnati in that game against Alabama. I think Cincinnati was absolutely shell-shocked that they got in and they got Alabama's best punch running the ball. And for about 2 quarters, Alabama could run the ball for 8 to 10 yards a carry. And it took a long time for Cincinnati to settle down enough to even make it a game. And I think you're going to see that from teams that are in weaker conferences that don't schedule good out of conference games. But anyway, thanks everybody. We've never really done this before. There are a lot of people that filtered in and out, so we appreciate it. Again, we're CFB Nerds on Twitter, so follow us on Twitter if you haven't. And especially go check out our YouTube channel, College Football Nerds. I'm really, that's where we do all our best content. That's our main arm, has been for almost 10 years now. And so if you like this discussion at all and you find it interesting, please like and subscribe, or go subscribe and hit that notification bell on YouTube, because this is generally what our conversations are like. And we may be accused of bias, but Michigan fans probably going to be pretty hot on us for a lot of our takes on the cheating scandal, which somebody brought up a minute ago. And yeah, we view that very negatively. But even still, I'd like to think that we're as neutral as possible when we evaluate the teams, and we try really hard not to let that bias as our opinion, even if we have been wrong on both sides, picking out Ohio State or Michigan for the last 4 years in the game. Um, Whatever biases we have, we do genuinely try not to give hot takes and try to give a reasoned opinion. So I appreciate this, everybody. I appreciate everybody that chimed in. And